up and down the west coast of Florida. Whether or not you are in the cone right now, you have the potential for being in danger. Our hurricane expert and former director of the National Hurricane Center, Dr. Rick Knabb, is here with a look at the latest with this and what is expected in time. The window for getting ready, Dr. Knabb, is getting really small real soon, and it's still a tropical storm.
Yeah, in fact, if you ask me or any former or current director of the Hurricane Center, for that matter, what really, really worries you, what scenario worries you, and it's rapid intensification right up to landfall in a short amount of time, going from tropical storm to major hurricane in the day and a half right before landfall. Those are the most difficult scenarios to get people to respond.
But that's it. It's really not about the meteorology. It's how people, the communication and how people perceive the meteorology, right?
Now, it used to be more of a meteorological challenge than it is. I'm not saying it isn't. I mean, this forecast is still difficult to get it really correct. And I hope it ends up underachieving, but I don't, those aren't what the signs are. But notice in past years, recent years, there's been more aggressive intensity forecasts from the Hurricane Center that turned out correct. Look at Ian last year. It went from this intensity at 70 miles an hour to a major hurricane in 26 hours when it first went from tropical storm to major hurricane. And the Hurricane Center was pretty well on that. So Laura's intensity forecast, pretty on point to what happened. So there's more and more reason to trust the intensity forecast when it explicitly forecasts rapid intensification. Chris, we didn't used to do this back in the day, to go from 70 to 105 miles an hour in a 24-hour forecast, but the science has improved. Our track record has improved. And so we got to trust the forecast and focus on what it's going to be, not what it is now.
And that is really what we, like you said, you have to focus on. And going from a tropical storm to the day after tomorrow, a potential Category 3 making landfall, a major hurricane.
Yeah, now this is going from 70 to 105 miles an hour. That takes you up to Cat 2. But it won't be long after that, if this forecast is right, to get to Cat 3 at 115 miles an hour. And that's why we are saying we need to plan for a major hurricane coming ashore in the northeastern Gulf. And that's always bad news because this is such a vulnerable coastline to storm surge, and it's going to be impacting people inside and outside the cone with wind and water. And look at, when it comes to the details, could we get the center come ashore in Apalachicola? That's a possibility. Could it come ashore in Clearwater? That's a possibility. Anything in between. So who gets the worst storm surge and wind? That's the hard detail to point out. But who is at risk? We know that a lot of us are, both inside and outside the cone. Got to get ready tonight and tomorrow, because this time tomorrow night, tropical storm conditions are arriving.
Yeah, and tropical storm conditions are going to be possible throughout parts of Georgia and the Carolinas as well.
That's right.
All right, let's go ahead and take a live look right now. Florida's first coast.
Yeah, Jacksonville. Now, conditions are not so bad tonight, and that gives you the opportunity to prepare, but they're expected to worsen tomorrow with tropical storm watch in effect. So, we're not quite within that 36-hour warning time frame, but that could change very quickly. And also, Chris, some coastal effects on the northeast coast of Florida. We saw how with Ian, something coming ashore in the Gulf can really impact the northeast Florida coast on the other side.
Yeah, the wind is going to get here. This is a virtual look right now. Here in Jacksonville, where I'm standing, a virtual look along the St. Johns River here with heavy rain that is expected out of this. A lot of clouds, but also we're going to add a lot more wind. A lot of these trees will be blowing around as well. So let's take a look at what is possible, what we're expecting here through time. Starting at 8 o'clock Wednesday morning, day after tomorrow in the morning, winds 20-25 miles an hour, and then up to 35 to 40 with some of these wind gusts by lunchtime. It is going to be a stormy day throughout a lot of northern Florida, and then conditions will be improving, at least wind-wise, along the west coast, while it's still 35 to 40 mile an hour wind gusts possible in Jacksonville, Jax Beach, down to St. Augustine as well. And here's now Thursday when conditions considerably calm down. And now here's a look at the rainfall. Now, when you look at this, you see 4 to 5 inches, 1 to 2. These are specific numbers, but it's really going to be more of a range. And it is certainly a possibility that there's going to be a lot more than this. Several inches of rain, also a possibility. Let's head up into Georgia now and take a look at Savannah. It's dark, it's cloudy, but it's hot. Winds already gusting at 22 miles an hour, not related to Idalia, but eventually there will be some strong winds that will be related to Idalia here. And this is the evening hours. Wednesday, now the overnight hours on Thursday. Could see wind gusts around 75 miles an hour in Hilton Head. Charleston, 15 to 20 mile an hour winds toward the end of it as it's heading out. Also expecting to see some heavy rain in that 3 to 4 inch range as well. All right, so now here in Raleigh, North Carolina, also looking inland here, heavy rainfall with the system could impact areas depending on the track. It still remains to be seen exactly where the center of it goes. But the heaviest of rain could be several counties away from the ocean with the track of Idalia. It depends on how that goes. So make sure you stay with the Weather Channel. We do have live team coverage to take you.
Hundreds of millions of lives impacted.
Look at the wind howling through here.
Thousands of storms forecasted. 40 years of storytelling. And a former National Hurricane Center director. One trusted best-in-class expert team. America's most trusted news network. The Weather Channel.
You need to listen to your local officials, and they are going to be giving you information, but you can also go to floridadisaster.org. They have a lot of information, the best and the most current information on how people can get assistance to evacuate. So those local officials are the ones that are going to give them the most current and up-to-date info and resources about where they need to go.
Back here in Tampa, hurricane warnings are up. Evacuation orders have been issued for these coastal counties. Zone A, that's the most vulnerable zone. B and C could be added sometime later tonight or certainly on Tuesday. So be aware and get the latest information on those evacuations. Right now, everything is calm, but, you know, things are going to change rapidly as we go through the day on Tuesday. The worst of the weather expected later tomorrow night into Wednesday, when we expect wind gusts to peak out between about 50 and 60 miles an hour. That will include some power outages. Meanwhile, they're prepping over at the General Hospital. That is Tampa General Hospital. They've got the aqua fence. They staged it yesterday. They put this up for Ian, and they now are assembling it. They're putting it together, and it's up for Idalia, which will be bringing the surge in 4 to 7 feet expected, plus or minus based on the exact track intensity and the tides. Meanwhile, today we talked to the mayor about the hospital system and how they're prepping ahead of this potential hurricane.
That is our Trauma One hospital in the city of Tampa, and it is located on Davis Islands, which is in a flood area. And so they purchased that fencing for the last storm season, so it hasn't been tried out yet. Hopefully, I hope that it's not tried out at all, but we'll see. It's a pretty fascinating approach to a storm surge by Tampa General Hospital.
And when we're talking about surge, we have to continue to look at the tides, the high tides, and the moon cycle. There's the moon tonight over Tampa Bay. Full moon coming up on Wednesday. and that's going to occur with high tides Wednesday morning around 4 a.m. and then again Wednesday late afternoon. Those are the high tides that are a concern with that onshore flow, especially Wednesday morning as we get the strongest push of the wind pushing the water into Tampa Bay from, at that point, will be Hurricane Idalia, Chris. So the moon makes a big difference. It can increase those tides a little bit, and we'll see how things end up with the surge, the moon, the cycle of the moon, and what ends up happening on this coast. But as you know, the worst surge at this point expected up in the Big Bend of Florida.
All right, meteorologist Mike Seidel, thank you so much. Up in the storms once again, like they were last week, the hurricane hunters. This is video when the hurricane hunters were flying through Franklin. Now it is Idalia here with a tropical storm force winds that we're watching right now. And this is expected to become a hurricane. Let's just get going here, Dr. Nab, and want to talk a little bit about what Mike said about the Big Bend and kind of reiterate that threat. But let's see what we have here. Yeah,
so when you look at the satellite, you definitely see this big blow up of thunderstorms on the westernmost tip of Cuba, right near where the center is. Is that the beginning of the inner core really building itself, taking shape? One thing that happens is you go into the nighttime hours. So, during the day, we saw some overshooting tops here as we lost the sun. But then look at what's happening now. Wow, I mean, some really big
it just has that boom.
Now, one thing that happens at nighttime is with the cooling of the cloud tops, you actually make the atmosphere a little bit more unstable in the tropics at night. And so there's a nighttime convective maximum oftentimes with these tropical systems. So I'm really concerned about it gets into the southeastern Gulf, gets away from land, the nighttime convective maximum, it could really take off. Really, really concerned about that, especially when you got those super warm waters. And look at where it's headed, to this loop current. Over the next several hours, deep, warm water, and the upper level outflow. Look at it breathing. Look at that. There's just no wind shear coming in to disrupt this. So, given all of that, hurricane hunters are out there, and we've got two planes. So here is one of the planes. This is the NOAA plane, and they're at 8,000 feet. And then you've got the Air Force plane, and they're at 10,000 feet. I'm sorry, I got them backwards. So go back. There's the satellite presentation. This is the Air Force plane. So you can see it came from Mississippi. That's the Air Force plane at 10,000 feet. And they look like they're going to try to intercept it after it leaves the western tip coming from the northwest. Then the NOAA plane is at 8,000 feet. So two planes going in and out of the center, trying to stay away from land and going through a very bumpy tropical storm. But they're 2,000 feet separated in altitude. So they're not going to run into one another. They're safe. But we're going to have two planes monitoring this for the next few hours, and then more missions after that.
And the idea is to figure out what we have now and also help get better information of the forecast models.
Yes, and given the conditions that we see in the Gulf of Mexico, ocean and atmosphere, the Hurricane Center, a very aggressive forecast. And let's take one quick lesson from Ian last year. Remember last year, Ian came ashore on the right-hand side of the cone. So Tampa is not out of the woods. A track like this would be really bad storm surge. What if it goes left side of the cone? Really bad for Apalachicola, Tallahassee.
And something interesting that you said a little bit earlier was even if it goes down here and you're on the winds going offshore, you're not necessarily safe because the winds are still bringing water up into the bend and bringing it around.
Yeah, the water's going to pile up in here and then maybe go around the north side of the storm. So the left side of the storm could still be really bad wind and water.
All right, thank you, Dr. Nab. Our continuing coverage, more after this.
Idalia bringing intense wind and rain to Cuba today, and now the storm is tracking towards Florida, less than 48 hours away from landfall. And tonight, nearly 15.5 million people are under tropical alerts. From central Florida into South Carolina, preparations underway from sandbagging to stocking up on supplies. And that includes the Tampa Bay area, where we find our own Mike Seidel this evening. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Chris, here in the Tampa-St. Pete area, hurricane warnings, storm surge warnings, and many now in Zone A under mandatory evacuations ahead of what is going to be could be a major hurricane. We'll come back and time it out, give you an idea of the worst weather and the impacts here along the Sun Coast in just a few minutes. Chris?
I'm meteorologist Chris Bruin alongside storm specialist Carl Parker. We're live tonight until 1 a.m. Eastern here on the Weather Channel to keep you up to date with the latest details as we watch Tropical Storm Idalia. The latest advisory, the new advisory with an updated cone and track, that'll be up at 11 p.m. Eastern time. And of course, we want to get the latest on what we know with Idalia right now with storm specialist Carl Parker.
Well, Chris, we're talking about an enormously scary situation here as we're looking at a very strong storm, likely a major hurricane coming into the most surge vulnerable section of coastline in the United States. Right now, it is a 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm, so it's on the cusp of becoming a hurricane and moving north at 8 miles per hour. Looking at the satellite picture today, we see there has been some restriction of the outflow on the northwest side, but that core is holding steady. And when you've got that core that's really put together like that and it gets into a slightly more favorable environment, it is likely going to begin to take off. We've been watching this ridge of high pressure off to the west here, driving a little bit of drier air into the northwest side, but that's going to back away. And then as the storm continues up into the eastern part of the Gulf, water temperatures get warmer and warmer and warmer. So there's a tremendous amount of available energy for this storm, and the shear is going to be lessening, which is why the Hurricane Center now forecasting a major hurricane to come up here into the area of the northeast Gulf and near the Big Bend region of Florida. But exactly where it's going to go remains to be determined. A lot of times it's hard to tell exactly where these things are going to head until you're getting pretty close to landfall. If it is a little farther to the right side here than anywhere between, say, Cedar Key and Hudson, that would maximize the surge potential there in Tampa. That would be incredibly bad news for a highly populated section of Florida that has not been hit that hard in recent years by hurricanes. But if it's a little more towards the center of the track or the left side of the track, that could reduce the impact there in Tampa, but certainly could bring a tremendous surge into parts of northwest Florida, including Alligator Point and all across the Nature Coast there and the Big Bend region. So we're looking at really significant surge potential across a huge area of the coastline here. 8 to 12 feet is the current storm surge potential there on the Nature Coast, the Big Bend area, 6 to 9 feet into Hudson, 4 to 7 feet in the Tampa Bay area. That is a life-threatening level of storm surge, even 3 to 5 feet farther south down towards Fort Myers Beach and 2 to 4 feet into Naples. And you notice the timing of this. It may not happen exactly like this, but this is roughly how it's going to go down. And we see the center of circulation coming up here into the Big Bend area. And that's when we see this maximum onshore push along the west coast of Florida that will coincide with the high tide in the very early morning hours there on Wednesday morning. And so that's when we could be looking at significant water level rises along the coast. We've been talking about evacuations today. There have been many evacuations issued for the Tampa Bay metro area for Zone A and some others as well. And so, you want to get away from the coast, essentially. You want to get a little farther inland. You don't have to, evacuate hundreds of miles inland. You just have to get away from the coast. And certainly there's very vulnerable areas in these barrier islands here, St. Pete Beach and Reddington Beach, then into the eastern part of St. Petersburg, and then all on the east coast of Tampa Bay there, Ruskin and also Apollo Beach. A lot of those areas under threat for significant surge. And here you see all of those areas that are in Zone A where we could be looking at that 4 to 7 foot storm surge. Also, hurricane warnings in effect in the Tampa Bay metro area and up through the Big Bend, and hurricane watches farther inland into Gainesville and Ocala, and then right up to the Georgia line there. And I want to show you the latest forecast from the National Hurricane Center looking at the area of strong winds. And so that begins to impact the west coast of Florida going into very early on Wednesday morning. So here you see this is actually late Tuesday. By the time we get into 1 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday morning, that's when we're starting to see those tropical storm force winds spreading onshore. And then you see the hurricane force winds coming in just a little to the north of Tampa and more towards Cedar Key. if it were to happen exactly like that. But again, some deviation is still possible with this storm. But we are looking at what is likely going to be an incredibly powerful storm here. And we want to go to our Mike Seidel, who is in the Tampa Bay area tonight. And, you know, Mike, it's just amazing how important placement can be. When Ian came in, we actually saw a reverse storm surge there in Tampa because the center was just a little to the south. In this case, if the storm center is a little to the north of Tampa, could be just devastating for that region.
Yeah, certainly we're going to have a wind direction onshore, whereas with Ian to the south, the wind went offshore, so that saved them. Although many of the zones last year, A, B, and C, I talked to some hotels today, even Zone C was evacuated. Right now, evacuation Zone A has been evacuated. A mandatory evacuation order has gone out, and they may add B and C. We'll find out what happens tomorrow. In the meantime, behind me is Tampa International Airport in the distance, and I can tell you tomorrow, forget about it. All flights have been canceled. Wednesday now, they've canceled about 175 flights Wednesday, and that includes just under 60% of departures. So things will get better on Wednesday. Tampa has been very, very lucky. You know, Ian went in south. Charlie took the right turn on Friday the 13th, back about 10 years ago. The mayor addressed that today.
Been hit in a century. We continue to prepare and take these storms very, very seriously. We've put out an emergency order. Shelters are opening, called for evacuations in our lower lying areas, reminding our residents to be prepared and letting them know that we are prepared as a city to meet the needs if, in fact, we are hit by the hurricane.
And remember that if you're not in A, B, or C, you don't need to evacuate. You basically, run from the water, hide from the wind. But if you're outside of the evacuation zones, all you need to do is stay indoors, stay away from the wind, which could put down trees on power lines or on top of your car. The other issue you may have inland is flash flooding, depending on how much rain falls in a period of time, because we're going into the storm, Carl, with a 14.5-inch rainfall deficit so far this year. It's very, very dry on this side of the state, and so they can handle certainly a decent amount of rainfall. But if it comes too fast, too furious, it will add up and cause some localized flash flooding. Again, the bottom line is wind gust expected to pick up. Highest wind gusts tomorrow night after midnight into Wednesday morning here in St. Pete and Tampa, looking at 50 to 60 miles an hour, right on the threshold, which could knock out power in this area. So it's going to be a long next about 36 hours or so until we get this thing passes. Luckily, it is moving at a pretty good clip, so it's not going to lollygag and be around here. By Wednesday lunchtime, it's already up. The center's up by Jacksonville.
Mike, I'm wondering if you have any information as to whether or not people are largely heeding these evacuation orders, because we remember with Ian that there were a lot of people who did not evacuate when they were asked to. And, I think part of what went into that is the fact that they hadn't had a storm like that in that region for a very, very long time. They had Charlie, of course, but it was a much smaller storm, not nearly the same level of surge threat. And the same can be said about the Tampa Bay metro area. It's been a long, long time since we've had a storm this strong threatening Tampa. And I wonder if you've noticed whether or not people seem to be heeding those orders.
Well, I can tell you, talking to the locals at Fort Myers Beach the day after Ian, they didn't evacuate because they went through Charlie, which is a Cat 4, but it was a smaller storm and they didn't have surge issues. Ian was a much bigger storm, and they had 6 to 7 feet of water in their house, and they said, man, we should have evacuated. So every storm is different. As far as the locals, I'm not sure. I haven't had a chance to talk to them. We did see a lot of traffic northbound on 275 coming from St. Pete and Point South earlier, but some of the hotels here today, as soon as the evacuation order came out, 2 p.m. in Hillsborough County, they had the residents, they had to get out. Here, fortunately, we can stay here till tomorrow morning, but they're acting pretty promptly in these hotels. As far as what the locals are doing, we hope they are heeding the warnings, especially in Zone A, and getting out of harm's way, because you just don't know if this hurricane tomorrow makes a jog to the right. It could bring a higher surge than forecast into Tampa Bay, and there are already areas like Gulfport that are extremely vulnerable to surge. whether it's a 4-foot surge or a 7-foot surge. So we'll keep our fingers crossed, hope people heed the warnings. Better safe than sorry, but again, as I mentioned, if you're not in a surge zone, no need to leave. Stay home, stay away from the windows, and just don't drive until it's safe to drive, say later Wednesday or even Thursday.
Yeah, really tricky forecast, Mike, with the angle of the coastline being not all that far away from the angle of approach of this storm. Mike, thank you so much as always, and we'll talk to you again very shortly. I want to turn to Chris Bruin right now. And Chris, you're from Florida. You're from Southwest Florida. And, we've talked about this before. They have not had a ton of storms on the west coast of Florida that have been really high-end storms in recent decades. And you just hope that everybody is taking this seriously.
And we've seen in the past 10 years, we've seen a lot of these storms, forecasted. I will say the National Hurricane Center doing a great job forecasting the kind of higher end situation, major category 3. Hopefully it doesn't get that strong, but we've seen this too often, the intensifying storm right upon landfall, right at the coast.
Yeah, I mean, it really seems like when there's potential for a storm to get much stronger, that it is realized, more often than not in recent years, especially with there being so much warmth in the Gulf of Mexico. There's so much available energy for this thing, and the shear is going to be lessening. So, I can't really see why it wouldn't begin to take off tomorrow.
Yeah, so remember that when you're making your plans. And as far as impacts go, rainfall will be an issue, but the storm surge and the wind are actually going to be our biggest threats. Rainfall will be manageable. We'll have flooding because anytime you have a hurricane, you're going to have a lot of rainfall in a short period of time. But generally speaking, for a hurricane, it's moving relatively quickly by the time it makes landfall, so it won't be sitting around dumping double-digit rainfall totals. We could have high-end 6 to 8 inches in some spots of the Panhandle and maybe some of these coastal zones where you get those rainfall rates to be on the order of 2 to 3 inches per hour. But again, that heaviest core is going to be near that center, and then on the outside of that, you'll have 1 to 3 inches of rain. Some of those outer bands too can produce some extremely heavy rainfall and also very strong gusts. So there's a look at the cone. That's where the center will likely track, whether it's on the left edge of the cone or the right edge. But that will have drastic impacts for your neighborhood, depending upon where within that cone it goes. So let's walk you through some metro areas and what we may expect as we go throughout the day on Tuesday. Because remember, weather starts to go downhill this time tomorrow night. We're really going to be ramping those tropical storm force, even hurricane force gusts on the central west coast of Florida. So quiet tonight for most of Tampa. You saw Mike Seidel, the water behind him still as could be. Winds start to pick up, especially farther south tomorrow afternoon. We get that 30 to 35 mile per hour gusts. Some of those outermost tropical bands getting into South Florida, they'll be on the far periphery with the core of the activity still well offshore. Now, based on the current forecast, that keeps the worst of the winds west of the Tampa Bay area, but still we're looking at 40 to 60 mile per hour gusts, and that's all going to be overnight tomorrow night through the first half of the day on Wednesday. Then we get that onshore push, and that's when we're going to see the water rise. Once the storm gets to the north of Tampa Bay, that's when we get the water to fill into Tampa Bay. So unlike some of the past events, we're actually going to see some significant water level rise in Tampa Bay and across the Tampa Bay metro area into Pinellas County. And so we know how vulnerable that coastline can be. I'm also concerned about North Florida. You've got a lot more hillier terrain, that runoff filling up the river basins like the Suwannee River Basin, the Santa Fe River Basin back towards Gainesville. Look at the winds here. Winds could exceed 100 miles per hour depending upon the exact strength and where exactly this comes ashore. But Carl, some of these smaller coastal towns, it's not white sandy beaches here on the Nature Coast. If you live in Taylor County, Dixie County, Levy County, you need to evacuate. Those towns can be cut off. Even just the one road into and out of these small little beautiful fishing villages are going to be dangerous spots to be, especially with the storm.
Very surge vulnerable. And we wanted to talk a little bit more about the surge. And, water is the big killer in hurricanes. And so let's talk about the surge that is going to be threatening parts of the west coast here. And so we're looking at, wind gusts that are going to be very strong along the coast and onshore flow coming in to the west coast of Florida. And there is a look at the evacuation zones along the west coast. So that is zone A. That is the area that has been asked to evacuate today. And the reason why is because when you look at the storm surge potential, you see that we're looking at up to 6 feet and even up to 9 feet Pete there, parts of Reddington Shores, Madeira Beach, down into Sunshine Beach as well. And so this is the story all along the coast there in the Tampa and St. Pete area. This is what we want people to get away from, because there is very high potential for serious life-threatening surge here. We'll have much more on this coming up.
Well, preparations underway tonight in parts of Florida, Georgia, and also into South Carolina. These are where we have warnings right now. In the red, you've got tropical storm warnings. They include parts of the Big Bend of Florida, including Tallahassee, as well as Southwest Florida. Remember, still recovering from last year's Hurricane Ian. Sanibel Island, Captiva, you're in a tropical storm warning. Central Florida, tropical storm warning once you get inland. And the hurricane warning stretching from Manatee County, just north of Sarasota, through the Tampa Bay metro area, up through the Nature Coast and getting into northern parts of Florida. Gainesville, as well as Valdosta, Georgia, you're under a hurricane warning. We're talking nearly 15.5 million people under some sort of tropical alerts. And so the preparations have already been underway and need to be finishing up, because weather starts to go downhill on Tuesday. And we really are expecting a landfall early on Wednesday morning. So we're running out of time. If you need to get out, they have issued mandatory evacuations, and it takes time to get those folks out. So use these next 12 to 24 hours wisely and prepare for the worst, because there will be folks in these zones, not everybody, but in those zones, that will see maybe worse conditions than maybe what you're anticipating. Well, up and down the Gulf Coast of Florida, folks are getting ready for what could be a major hurricane when it makes landfall. Our Charles Peak has made the long trek to the Gulf Coast in Tampa, near Tampa, Charles, and you talked with a restaurant owner. How has he been getting things ready tonight?
Yeah, Chris, as I was working my way down here, I went to the community of St. Mark, Florida, and it's on the Wakulla River, and talked with Stan West, and he's got a restaurant there, the Riverside Cafe, and he was already having preparations going, but he's very seasoned with the hurricanes. He's had multiple ones there, and on one of the poles in the restaurant, he literally has marks of the different water levels. In one case, one even above his head. So listen to him as he tells a little about his experiences there, as well as his preparation for this one.
This is my poll of hurricanes, over 28 years worth. We have had Michael, which is way up here. We have had Dennis, which is down here. And we've had Earl, we've had Hermine, we've had Gustav, we've had Ivan, Opal. We've had a lot of hurricanes come through here. We're kind of prepared mostly. We get ready, we watch, and then we all of a sudden do what we got to do to either get ready or kind of just wait. And right now we're in the wait game because we don't know what it's going to do right this minute. They kind of are leaning towards it going a little south of us, which is really good for us. So we're kind of watching right now because we know that the west side is a little bit more gentle than the east side. The east side is where it throws it up in and brings it all out of here. The last time it happened for us, we lost all our river. It went all the way down to a trickle down in the bottom of this river, which is a big, deep river. So we know that we're on the good side of it right this minute. So we're hoping it doesn't do a jog, which they've been known to do. That's how we got Dennis. Dennis turned from Pensacola and came all the way over here and threw all that water at us. So we're keeping our fingers crossed and watching.
What is your preparation if it moves a little to the west and you're going to get the bad side?
If it moves a little to the west, we got a big old bus and we'll start loading everything up and getting as much out of here as we can and salvage what we can, and then we'll come back and wash it out and start over. We are set up for being able to wash the place down and get back up in business pretty dang quick. So we get ready for hurricanes. We know what hurricanes are. We live in Florida, and this is it.
Well, you can see Stan there is ready for whatever comes at him. He lives about 30 minutes north. This is just south of Tallahassee by about 30 minutes, and so he's got a safe place for him and his whole team to go. But they've got a plan to get the place ready. They were already moving some of this stuff tonight.
You know, Charles, I've been to St. Mark's. It's a quaint little beautiful town in North Florida, very low lying. You know, what was your drive like coming from there down to where you are in Crystal River? Did you notice the roads maybe congested with folks, or was it kind of business as usual? Would you say people are knowing what's ahead?
Yeah, there's definitely knowing along the waterway here, it wasn't really an evacuation route, so the traffic wasn't much. But you did come, as you were coming across the gas stations, they would be completely full as you would walk in and talk to people. They definitely knew what was going on. One police officer I talked to, he says, you know, they've already told me don't plan on going home tomorrow night. So they know what's coming, and they're watching it closely. And obviously, as Stan was talking about, hoping it doesn't, for them, jog to the west. But you know, a jog west or east, this means somebody else gets it. So, you know, everybody needs to be prepared for whatever's going to be coming here with this.
All right, we appreciate the update. Stay safe and stay well. Charles Peak in Florida, getting ready for whatever Idalia has across the Gulf Coast of Florida. Stay with the Weather Channel for continuing live coverage. We're going to bring you the latest, some of the forecasts coming up next.
Welcome back to our coverage of what is shaping up to be a significant event for the Gulf Coast of Florida. We're talking about what is likely going to be a major hurricane coming towards the northwest part of the coast there into the Big Bend area perhaps, and that is going to be as early as late tomorrow and going into early Wednesday as well. Right now, it is a 70-mile-per-hour storm. Don't be lulled by that, because this thing is most likely going to take off during the day tomorrow, even though there has been some shear affecting the system. We expect that shear is going to lessen. There is very warm water that is ahead of the system coming up into the eastern Gulf, and there's a very intact core. And in fact, we're just now starting to see some bursting occurring near that core. And so certainly tonight, I think there's going to be a lot of potential for this thing to get going. There you see the water temperatures. They are only going to be increasing as the storm works off to the north. Still some big questions about where exactly it is going to be headed, and it's doubly tricky because the angle of attack is not all that different from the angle of the coastline. So a little bit of a deviation makes a very big difference. And we have huge concern about what is going to happen in the Tampa area, and we want to get out to our Mike Seidel. He's been reporting on what's going on there. And, you know, Mike, this could be one of the most significant storms that we've seen there in Tampa in terms of surge in particular in a very long time, if the storm were to come in just a little farther to the north, somewhere between Tampa and Cedar Key.
Yes, that's the big question. Where does it come in? The closer it comes in, then we get the higher surge. Right now, the Hurricane Center forecasting 4 to 7 feet in the Tampa Bay area. That's a significant surge, and there will be impacts, certainly. How bad are they going to be? It remains to be seen. But again, we got to watch the track. It's moving north finally after sitting down there in the Yucatan Channel for a couple of days. When does it start feeling the steering and make that right turn? The American GFS model continues to bring it in to the western end of that cone. The Europeans more to the right or the eastern end, and the NHC's kind of in the middle. So we'll see where it goes in. But the bottom line is we've got the hurricane warnings flying. We've got the storm surge warning up, and also mandatory evacuations for these coastal communities, Zone A. The mayor addressed that earlier today.
We always send our resources throughout the Southeast to those communities that have been hit by hurricanes. And so we bring those lessons, good and bad, back to our community and make adjustments as necessary. But we are fully prepared here right now. Some of the things that we're doing, we're pulling the water out of some of our stormwater ponds. We're putting water over the dam into the river, which will lower our reservoir by about a foot, passing out literally tens of thousands of sandbags to our community, just making sure that everyone is aware. We're communicating constantly with our residents and letting them know that these storms can literally change at a moment's notice.
And Carl, we're going to be watching this because all we've talked about for several months is how warm the water is in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Atlantic. And it is going over the loop current, so we're not going to get the upwelling where it brings up cooler water. But, you know, as the late, great John Hope, our former hurricane expert who worked at the Hurricane Center years ago, said, you got to look at the wind shear. You got to look at the steering in the wind shear, because you can have water boiling out there. If you got too much wind shear, you're not going to get development. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens as it comes north over this warm water and how fast it does intensify. Boy, that intensification forecast is not etched in stone.
Yeah, that's for sure, Mike. And, you know, it's also interesting because it may well be that as we have some shear off to the north of the storm, that actually helps to enhance the circulation. As you know, when you've got wind shear that is not directly over the circulation, but rather near the circulation, that enhances that in, up, and out model there with the outflow of the storm. So it's entirely possible that too contributes to the strengthening of this storm. Let's take a look at the forecast track here along with the storm surge warning and watch. And this is a point that we've wanted to make over and over and over again. So often you hear people say, well, I was in the cone or wasn't in the cone, so I did X. And this is a really crystal clear example of why you should not be thinking in those terms, because you can have impacts that are well outside of the cone. Storm surge warnings now are outside of the cone. The cone is only showing you the best guess as to where the center of the storm is going to go, but there are impacts that are well outside of that cone, and especially on the right-hand side of the storm relative to its forward motion. We'll have more on that coming up here in just a few minutes, and the Weather Channel is going to stay on the story all through the night and into the day tomorrow. You can also follow us on our streaming app. Go to streamtwc.com to get it for Roku, Amazon, and Fire.
Watch the Weather Channel for ongoing coverage of Idalia. Get trusted updates on the storm only on the Weather Channel.
Well, people living in the Tampa area are busy gearing up for heavy rain, storm surge flooding, and high winds. Of course, that includes stocking up on the essentials like food, water, batteries, and boarding materials, and just making sure everything in your kit is up and running, right? Sometimes the batteries haven't been used in a while, and do they work? You just got to check those things out, and hopefully you've gotten those supplies as needed. Water starts to dwindle this time before a storm, and it's tough to even get gas. So hopefully you've already done that. If not, use this time tonight and early in the morning before conditions start to go downhill. What are we talking about? Where is Tropical Storm Idalia right now, and where's it headed? What are the impacts going to be like? Well, right now we still have, strong tropical storm, and you can see it was battling just a little bit of wind shear earlier, but now that's starting to fan out a little bit. We're starting to get much more favorable conditions, and once it gets away from Cuba, it's got just uninterrupted territory to really take off. So we really got to watch it overnight tonight. You can see that surge of thunderstorm activity near the center, and as this starts to get more symmetrical, that's when we'll start seeing the pressure drop and those winds start to go up. So let's get a look at the latest track. Now at 11 p.m. we'll get an update to this, but we don't expect too much in the way of change. Slight shifts to the west or to the east is possible, and that's also going to be indicative on how quickly this can ramp up. Does it ramp up more soon, or does it ramp up sooner, or does it take a little bit of Gulf of Mexico territory and then start to ramp up closer to landfall? all those minute little details are going to have a huge factor on the exact path, because it ends up on the left side. This would be a worst case scenario for, St. Mark's and areas north of Cedar Key and even Tallahassee, but a better situation for Tampa, versus if it were to be on the right side, which would be a literally worst case scenario for Tampa and areas just north of there up towards Clearwater and even up towards Crystal River. So we really got to watch everybody from the Big Bend down through Tampa Bay. It's fair game. Not everybody in those hurricane warnings will experience the worst conditions, but there will be folks who will. So be mindful of that. It's not just Florida. We've got tropical storm warnings up through Orlando, central Florida, and also here into southwest Georgia. But look at this. Hurricane watches go up into southern Georgia, into interior sections of Florida, and tropical storm watches now include the Georgia coast as well as the South Carolina coast, Hilton Head and Charleston. You're going to see some substantial impacts, especially when it comes to wind and storm surge, a very vulnerable coast here over coastal Georgia and South Carolina. Obviously, tropical storm force winds are very high probabilities here along the Gulf Coast of Florida, and those start to arrive as early as tomorrow afternoon with some of those outer squalls, some of those thunderstorms ahead with some of that moisture associated with Idalia. Jacksonville, we're talking Wednesday morning, but again, the worst will be about 6 to 12 hours after that. There's a look at the tropical storm force winds, the earliest arrival, and again, some of these outer bands may start to hit southwest Florida as early as tomorrow afternoon. Hurricane force conditions will be not as widespread, but watching that area around the Nature Coast. But really, the Big Bend through Tampa Bay really going to be key player here. And power outages expected from Tampa northward, even into Jacksonville and southeastern parts of Georgia. Storm surge, Carl, I think is a huge factor and may be our biggest threat with Idalia just because of the coastline and the push of water. I don't know if you remember Ada. I think we were in the Greek outfit just a few years ago when it hit Fort Lauderdale, when it was a weak tropical storm. But because it went north of Tampa, it brought a little bit of water level rise in Tampa, more than we've seen in some of the stronger hurricanes that brought all that water out of Tampa Bay because of where the storm was in relation to Tampa.
Yes, water is the number one killer with hurricanes, and it's such a surge vulnerable section of coastline. You go to the beach there in the St. Pete area, and you can walk out forever and be on your feet because the sea floor is very shallow going out for a long way. That's a big part of why we're so surge vulnerable. So we're expecting that this is going to be a major hurricane coming towards the coast very early on Wednesday. So that's looking just after midnight there. The storm is going to be approaching through the overnight hours tomorrow night, coming in early on Wednesday. But you notice the storm surge warning over a huge area outside of the cone on both sides, well to the south as well, including the Tampa Bay area, down to Sarasota, Bradenton, and farther southward as well. Storm surge watch towards Fort Myers Beach and Sanibel Island. So we are very concerned about the possibility of life-threatening storm surge here, and it's important that people living in vulnerable areas understand just how intense conditions can get. Here's Dr. Greg Postel to show you what storm surge can do.
As Idalia closes in on the west coast of Florida, likely late Tuesday, early Wednesday, significant, indeed life-threatening storm surge will accompany landfall. Reasonable worst-case scenarios suggest we could see water rises and inundation above normally dry ground that exceed 9 feet. Let me show you what that looks like by bringing the water first up to about 6 feet. It's too late to do anything at this point. The only way out is to go up. Who knows what's floating in this water? There could be large objects, hazardous material. There is really no way to get around this. But we think there are going to be places that get above this and maybe even above 9 feet of storm surge. Now this is not survivable. So make sure that you follow the advice of the local officials and the National Hurricane Center. That may just save your life.
So evacuations have been ordered, mandatory evacuations for Zone A across the Tampa Bay metro area. There's a look at where Zone A is. It includes those barrier islands from Clearwater Beach down to Redington, Madeira, down into St. Pete Beach as well. There you see the storm surge potential map. This is from the National Hurricane Center, and this is showing you the reasonable worst case scenario. So let's say the storm is very strong and comes in 20 to 30 miles north of Tampa Bay. This would be the worst case scenario in that scenario. And you see St. Pete Beach here. We're looking at a water level rise of up to 6 feet all across this area, South Pasadena and then farther north as well. And so that's why all of these areas are in Zone A. You want to be away from the coast when this thing is coming in. We'll have much more on this dangerous storm coming up in a few minutes.
Welcome back to Tampa. I'm meteorologist Mike Seidel, continuing coverage of our upcoming hurricane. It's only a 70-mile-an-hour tropical storm, Idalia, but it's expected to become a hurricane at any time. Our next complete advisory from the Hurricane Center with an updated track comes in about an hour, just before 11 o'clock Eastern time. We'll have it to you. We're live tonight till 1. Starting tomorrow morning, bright and early, we're going to be live around the clock to keep you safe. And speaking of keeping folks safe, there's now a mandatory evacuation for these coastal communities like here in Hillsborough County, down in St. Pete, Pinellas County, Pasco, Citrus, Hernando counties. That's for evacuation zone A. Carl showed those earlier. And that may be extended tomorrow to B and C, depending on the track. Right now, we're expecting a surge of 4 to 7 feet. And again, it's all subject to change. It may go up some, it may go down some, but the likelihood is highest for the worst surge north of here, up around Cedar Key and around to certainly the eastern part of what we call the Big Bend of Florida, Appalachia Bay. Fortunately, those areas are very underpopulated. I should say not densely populated. But Carl, tonight it's muggy, it's humid, and it's very, I'm very curious to see what happens in the next 12 to 18 hours, because it's all about that jog. When does it start to feel the influence of the steering off to the right? And that really impacts where the highest surge ends up and what happens downstream on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. So a lot of anticipation tonight here in Tampa, just how bad it could be.
Yeah, very interesting looking at the trends on satellite tonight, Mike. Mike, I'm wondering where you are there in the Tampa Bay area. Maybe your photo could even widen out a little bit to give us a look at your location. And what is your plan? What are you going to be doing over the next day or so as the storm is getting closer?
Okay, we'll have Rodney Hall, our photog, out here. He's been through many of these over many years. And we're looking back on the causeway. And this is the causeway that goes to Clearwater and Clearwater Beach. And you're looking back towards Tampa. And that's the Tampa International Airport, which I can tell you at midnight tonight, no more flights go out. There may be some international flights that come in after midnight, but no flights tomorrow. Everything has been canceled. Then Wednesday right now, about 60% of departures have been canceled. This is evacuation zone A, as you may suspect. We're right here on the water. So we are going to be checking out at this hotel in the morning and heading a bit inland. We're going to be heading inland into Tampa and an area that's not in the first 3 evacuation zones A, B, and C. That's going to keep us safe. We also have a parking garage just in case, but we're going to be far enough inland we don't have to worry about the surge. Again, if you're not in one of those evacuation zones, Carl, as you know, you don't need to evacuate. A lot of folks get on the highway and just drive away from the storm. You don't need to go to Orlando. You don't need to go to Melbourne or Daytona, or certainly south of Daytona, or over towards West Palm or Miami. Stay put. Stay away from the windows. Just stay indoors, away from the wind, because if we do get gusts in excess of 60 miles an hour, that can blow trees down and power lines. And how many times, Carl, have we said where folks go out and they end up losing their life because a tree goes down on their car? Stay indoors until the threat from wind damage diminishes later Wednesday and Wednesday night.
Yeah, run from the water and hide from the wind, Mike. And, you know, it's a little surprising because I know that many of those evacuations are supposed to take place by 7 o'clock tonight, but apparently the tolls have not been lifted across the state until 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm not really sure why that is, and I'm sure they're probably trying to work to figure that out. Mike, thank you so much. We'll talk to you again in just a few minutes, and let's give you the latest on the storm right now. It is a 70-mile-per-hour storm, and it is moving to the north at 8 miles per hour. Now, when you look at the satellite imagery here, you see there's been a big burst. We saw this last night, big burst of convection near that center. It's been impinged a little bit on the west and northwest side by some wind shear, and that's held it back just a little bit. We think that wind shear is going to lessen, and as it moves north, it's going to work over very, very warm water in the Gulf of Mexico, and that is likely going to make this thing a major hurricane as it is approaching the coast. Now, there's still some difficulty in determining exactly where that center is going to be, and it matters more when the coast is angled the way that it is. So obviously, if it's on the right side of that track, that's going to have a bigger impact there in the Tampa metro area. Left side, less of an impact. Right down the middle, it's going to have still a wide array of impacts, especially around the Big Bend area of Florida and farther southward. So there's the storm surge potential, which extends all the way down the coast. And so important to keep in mind that even if you're not in the cone, it doesn't matter with respect to the water level rise that can occur with a storm this strong, especially in this most surge vulnerable section of coastline in the entire country. Now, here's a look at the forecast for the winds. This is from the National Hurricane Center. So that area of orange is the tropical storm force winds. They're starting to affect the coast. They're around Sarasota and Bradenton and farther southward tomorrow night at this time, and then beginning to overspread the Tampa metro area going through late tomorrow into 1 o'clock in the morning. Hurricane force winds may be just offshore. Then the hurricane force winds start to come in early on Wednesday morning. We've also got this maximum push of onshore flow coming into those areas south of that center at that time, and there's going to be a high tide in the morning. So that's when we certainly could be looking at some significant flooding. Then strong wind comes up through the north central part of the state, Gainesville, and towards Jacksonville as well through the middle of the day and into the afternoon. A lot of potential for wind damage and very heavy rain. And we'll have more on all that coming up in a few minutes.
Idalia bringing intense wind and rain to Cuba today, and now the storm is tracking towards Florida. Less than 48 hours away from landfall, and people are preparing. Tonight, nearly 15.5 million people are under tropical alerts. This is not only in Florida, but they extend into Georgia as well as South Carolina. Preparations underway from sandbagging to stocking up on supplies, and that includes the Tampa Bay area, where we find our very own Mike Seidel this evening.
Hi, Chris, from Tampa, St. Pete. And again, tonight, evacuation orders are underway starting this afternoon. Also, the hurricane warning, the storm surge warning, we'll time it out for you when we think the worst will hit this area coming up in just a few minutes. But first, let's go back to Atlanta. Get the latest forecast and analysis from Chris Bruin. Chris?
Hey, thanks, Mike. I'm meteorologist Chris Bruin alongside storm specialist Carl Parker. We're live tonight through 1 a.m. Eastern, midnight Central Time. Concern growing tonight that we could see a major hurricane slamming the Gulf Coast of Florida. And Carl, I think a lot of people may be thinking, man, this has been a tropical storm for a while. Can it intensify as quickly in a shorter period of time? And that may catch people off guard just because it's been so slow to develop. And then boom, it's going to really kind of ramp up in a pretty short window.
Yeah, these things can move very, very quickly when they get into the right environment. And there's been some wind shear today, and that has certainly had an effect on the system. But we think that wind shear is going to lessen, and it's going to be moving over extraordinarily warm water. And so there's really no reason to believe that it's not going to become a significant event for the west coast of Florida. Again, a 70-mile-per-hour storm right now. It is finally now beginning to move to the north. That long anticipated move to the north finally occurring. Notice the big burst of thunderstorms occurring near the center. We saw the same thing last night. And so that core is very much intact. That's really important because when you've got a very well-developed core, even if the rest of the storm doesn't look like a classic storm, a classic hurricane, that core, once it gets into the right environment, can just really take off. Now, here you see a ridge of high pressure, and that's been driving some drier air into the circulation, a little bit of wind shear as well. But we think that will lessen through the day tomorrow, and then the storm comes up into areas where there is so much warmth in the Gulf of Mexico. Water temperatures getting up into the upper 80s to near 90 before the storm comes onshore. Also, the upper level winds may actually help with the evacuation of mass as they get stronger towards the coast there. So again, we do expect that it is going to be a major hurricane coming towards the coast. It's going to be very early in the morning on Wednesday. And here you see the storm surge warnings over a very large area from Apalachicola and Alligator Point through the Big Bend area there in the Nature Coast down down into Tampa as well, well outside of that cone. We've heard people say many, many times, well, I was in the cone or I wasn't in the cone, so I did X. Please don't do that, because the impacts are going to be well outside of the cone. The cone is only showing you where the center is expected to be. Now, obviously, if the center is closer to Tampa Bay, maybe 20, 30 miles to the north between Tampa Bay and Cedar Key, that's going to maximize the potential for a surge in Tampa. Whereas if it's more towards Alligator Point in Apalachicola, that will bring some of the impacts down. But we still expect to see a large area of water level rise coming into the West Coast, because it is going to be a very powerful storm, and because this is the most surge vulnerable section of coastline in the entire country. Right now, forecast for 4 to 7 feet of storm surge in the Tampa Bay metro area, 6 to 9 feet to the north of that, 8 to 12 around Cedar Key. So this is all really life-threatening surge that we're talking about here. And this is one model solution showing you storm approaching there on Wednesday morning. So that's when we're starting to see that onshore push really being maximized along the West Coast and in Tampa Bay. We've got a high tide Tampa Bay around 4 o'clock in the morning. And so that's when we could expect to see some of the worst surge. And again, that's going to be dependent on the track of the storm. Now, evacuations have been ordered, mandatory evacuations for Zone A across the Tampa Bay metro area. And that's all these barrier islands from Clearwater Beach down to Reddington and then down into Madeira and St. Pete Beach as well. Also here around Anna Maria Island and Longboat Key, and then along the Manatee River, and then along the east side of the bay, and also in eastern parts of St. Petersburg, and then getting towards McDill as well. So in all of these areas, there's going to be potential for a storm surge of up to 6 feet or maybe even higher in some spots, and that's why we're so worried about people getting away from the coast. You don't have to go that far. You just have to get off the coast when you have that level of threat. And then also there's wind to be concerned about. There is a hurricane warning now from Tampa and on northward, also a hurricane watch in the north central part of the state, including Gainesville and up towards Lake City, and could be some very strong winds into Jacksonville as well. Here you see the area of strong winds starting to come in, and so by this time we get into, say, 9 to 10 o'clock tomorrow night, we're probably starting to see those tropical storm force winds in orange moving onshore near Tampa. They continue to overspread the west central part of the state going through the early morning hours, and then the really strong winds coming in beyond that going towards daybreak there around the Big Bend area of Florida. But again, a shift in the track is going to change that a little farther to the east. It's going to be more towards Tampa, a little farther to the west, more towards Apalachicola. And we want to go out to our Mike Seidel right now. He is in Tampa Bay. And Mike, we've had some evacuations ordered already, and a lot of concern about the high water there, because this is such, as we've said many times, such a surge vulnerable section of coastline. I don't know if you've been to the beach in that area, but I went to Reddington Beach years ago, and I was just amazed at how far you can walk out and still be on your feet. And that tells the story about that very shallow continental shelf in that area.
Yeah, what we call the bathymetry of the water all the way up to Cedar Key and in the Big Bend, very susceptible to storm surge. Remember the superstorm in March of '93? We had a 12-foot surge, and that was in the wintertime up in the Big Bend area. So we'll see how it all shakes out. Tonight, we have the mandatory evacuations. I've been watching the Courtney Campbell Causeway. Traffic going away from the camera is coming from Clearwater Beach in Clearwater, and there's certainly not a rush of people, at least at this hour, to get out. But I think many people know that the timing on this, they've got, tomorrow morning and even early tomorrow afternoon to get out of harm's way. So even though the mandatory evacuations kicked in at 2 p.m. here in Hillsborough County, for instance, at our hotel, we can stay overnight tonight. We have to be out by noon tomorrow. Let's talk about preps in the city of Tampa at Tampa General Hospital. And this is the aqua fence. They put it up last year for Ian, and they put it back up today. It surrounds the building, keeps the surge out, keeps the hospital open, which is what we need, because there could be impacts and folks may end up in the hospital. Let's hope not. And the mayor addressed the safety concerns tonight.
That is our Trauma One hospital in the city of Tampa, and it is located on Davis Islands, which is in a flood area. And so they purchased that fencing for the last storm season, so it hasn't been tried out yet. Hopefully, I hope that it's not tried out at all, but we'll see. It's a pretty fascinating approach to a storm surge by Tampa General Hospital.
Now, what a great idea to keep that hospital open and up and running, as she said, their top trauma center in the area. Meanwhile, tonight, Carl, we await the 11 p.m. forecast and new track and advisory from the National Hurricane Center, and then the additional what we call 0Z Greenwich time runs from the American model GFS and the Euro coming up between midnight and 2 a.m. Because it's all about that track and how far north does it go before it makes that turn to the northeast into the coastline of Florida early on Wednesday morning.
Mike, thank you so much. We certainly do appreciate your reporting. We'll talk to you again very soon. And we want to go now to our Chris Bruin and talk a little bit more about some of the impacts here in Southwest Florida. Of course, we saw, a major storm last year in Ian that initially looked like it might have an impact in Tampa, and then sort of at the last minute made a little bit of a turn to the right. And, just a reminder that, a lot of times, storms will surprise you. Yeah. You might think you've got it sort of dialed in. And, at least in this case, we haven't seen a whole lot of movement in terms of the general area where we think it's going to have an impact. But, there's always some chance that you can see some shifting. And that's why it's really, really important to not, get sort of set about the idea of where this is going. You can always wake up tomorrow and find out that the modeling has changed and we have something that's a little bit different than what we're looking at tonight.
Yeah, and this side of the state particularly vulnerable to those last minute changes, even more so because it dramatically increases your storm surge, obviously your impacts. But I think what happens over the next 12 hours will be telling if it takes a more right-sided track or a left-sided track. If it ramps up more quickly, it may favor that easterly side more so than if it stays a little weaker over 12 hours and then takes a later turn to really ramp up.
And that was the thing that was so, terrible about what happened with Ian, because not only did it take more of a right-hand track, but it also was coming in sooner because of that.
Exactly.
And that really made it hard because, for the longest time, it seemed like it was going to be set on the northwest part of the state. Again, at least the modeling does seem to have settled in, broadly speaking, over the last couple of days. But, there's always some potential for more change.
Yeah, but even the Big Bend versus north of Tampa is going to have huge impact. So we're looking like the Nature Coast, the northeastern part of the Gulf side of Florida. So anywhere from the Big Bend to Tampa really has to watch this closely. There's a look at the track. We also are going to talk about some of the impacts we're going to see into Georgia and South Carolina, even North Carolina in just a few minutes. But let's start with Florida because they will see the worst of Idalia, and rainfall will be a factor, and there will be the flash flood concern, but it's not going to be our biggest threat. 6 to 8 inches on the higher end is what we're looking at. Generally speaking, there will be a few isolated areas that see a bit more. So quickly rising rivers, creeks, and streams. Remember, too, in central and south Florida, rivers act very differently. It takes a lot longer for them to come up than in northern Florida. So that'll be something we're watching. Tampa, we're looking at anywhere from 3 to 6 inches of rain. Higher totals right now look to be closer to the coast, but that's based on the track. Winds start to go up as we head into this time tomorrow, and overnight tomorrow night, we really start to see that southerly flow. And then once winds come out of the south and west, that's when we'll see the biggest rise in water. So the winds will pick up first here in Tampa Bay, and then the water will come up after that. So keep that in mind. The winds will ramp up throughout the first half of your day on Wednesday. Water comes up later on Wednesday into early Thursday. For northern Florida, it depends on where you're at, but where the winds are coming offshore, you're not going to have that water rise. Where they're coming onshore, they're going to be coming up pretty quickly. And here's where we may have landfall. In some of these towns, I've been to Stenhatchee, areas around Cedar Key, they're beautiful, but this is not one of those storms you want to be at. These have already mandatory evacuations, Carl, have already been implemented here. And there's not like white sandy beaches in this part of Florida. It's more like the low country coast of South Carolina. It's marshy. You got grasses. Typically, you'll have drier areas at low tide, and then the water will come in at high tide.
And a lot of times you have just one road between the coast and going inland.
And they're not even bridges. They're more like causeways.
Yes, exactly. So, just a lot of worry about high water there. And we wanted to talk a little bit more about the storm surge surge threat because, again, it is really significant. There you see the Florida evacuation zone, Zone A, under mandatory evacuation across the Tampa Bay metro area right now. That includes a large part of the populated zones here along the beaches into Reddington Beach, farther southward St. Pete Beach. There's a look at the storm surge potential, and we wanted to talk about an area that is on the south side here near St. Pete Beach, near Shore Boulevard. And this is a look, this is Gulfport, Florida. This is a look at what we would be talking about were we to see this worst case scenario. Now, the worst case scenario would be a major hurricane coming in between Cedar Key and Tampa, maybe 20 to 30 miles north of Tampa, because that would maximize that onshore push of water coming right up into Tampa Bay. And so you can see here what that would look like in Gulfport, Florida. And, the water, appears to be rather still in this case. But what we saw really clearly from Fort Myers Beach and Ian was that that's not the case. The water's got flow to it. There's wave action. There's a lot of wind on top of that. If you're in a situation like that with a water level rise of up to 6 feet that occurs with all kinds of wave action, it's really not survivable. The only way you can survive something like that is by evacuating vertically, by getting up into a building. But if you're on the ground and you're on the first level of any structure, you absolutely are going to have your life being threatened by this level of surge. And so that is what really has us worried here across parts of the Tampa Bay metro region. And so, Chris, hopefully it doesn't work out that way, but, it's entirely possible that it does. I mean, we can't say that it won't at this point. And it's been a long, long time since we've had a really serious storm in the Tampa Bay metro area. There are, millions of people that live there, and it's been decades since we've had an incredibly strong storm there. So many people have moved there. Yeah. Infrastructure has not been tested in that region. I mean, we thought that might happen with Ian. It was actually the opposite because they were, just to the north of the circulation. So, this does have potential to be a really big deal in Tampa.
So that's something we're watching. And simultaneously, remember, this is going to have a broad onshore flow on the Atlantic side as well. So we're going to get coastal flooding and storm surge even over towards the first coast, St. Augustine and Jacksonville. And we want to talk about really quickly some of the impacts we'll see as we go into Thursday, later Wednesday and Thursday for places like Savannah. In fact, Savannah, Georgia and Hilton Head, Beaufort, South Carolina, we could get upwards of 6 to 8 inches of rainfall. And models are still varying on who's going to see it. GFS wants to go a little bit more towards the west with this. That brings the heavier rain more inland towards the Midlands and also across central and southern Georgia. But there's a look at the timing. Again, North Florida getting the worst as we go into Wednesday afternoon and again early Wednesday morning, and then pushing into Georgia by Wednesday evening and early Thursday morning.
Power through every...
Preparations underway tonight in parts of Florida, even Georgia and the Carolinas, as we have hurricane and tropical storm watches and warnings now out tonight, including in Tampa, Orlando, even into Valdosta, Georgia. You're under a hurricane warning. Tropical storm watches, they go up through coastal Georgia and even the low country coast of South Carolina. Nearly 15.5 million under those alerts. And in the town of St. Mark's, Florida, that's just south of Tallahassee, our Charles Peak actually talked to the owner of a restaurant that sits on the Waukulla River. Stanley West has been through several hurricanes before and told our Charles Peak what he plans to do when it comes to Idalia, and he looks at the unique way he tracks the impacts from past storms.
This is my poll of hurricanes over 28 years worth. We have had Michael, which is way up here. We have had Dennis, which is down here. And we've had Earl, we've had Hermine, we've had Gustav, we've had Ivan, Opal. We've had a lot of hurricanes come through here. We're kind of prepared mostly. We get ready, we watch, and then we all of a sudden do what we got to do to either get ready or kind of just wait. And right now we're in the wait game because we don't know what it's going to do right this minute. They kind of are leaning towards it going a little south of us, which is really good for us. So we're kind of watching right now because we know that the west side is a little bit more gentle than the east side. The east side is where it throws it up in and brings it all out of here. The last time it happened for us, we lost all our river. It went all the way down to a trickle down in the bottom of this river, which is a big, deep river. So we know that we're on the good side of it right this minute. So we're hoping it doesn't do a jog, which they've been known to do. That's how we got Dennis. Dennis turned from Pensacola and came all the way over here and threw all that water at us. So we're keeping our fingers crossed and watching.
What is your preparation if it moves a little to the west and you're going to get the bad side?
If it moves a little to the west, we got a big old bus and we'll start loading everything up and getting as much out of here as we can and salvage what we can, and then we'll come back and wash it out and start over. We are set up for being able to wash the place down and get back up in business pretty dang quick. So we get ready for hurricanes. We know what hurricanes are. We live in Florida, and this is it.
All right, St. Mark's certainly being prepared because it's a vulnerable spot, and dependent upon the track of Idalia is going to be key for the extent of the impact, especially when it comes to the storm surge, because that's going to be the most detrimental threat, we think, with Idalia and the winds. Because remember, this is forecasted to become a major hurricane. Now, right now, it's still struggling. It's been battling a little bit of wind shear. We haven't seen rapid intensification at all. It's been holding as a pretty strong tropical storm, kind of reorganizing. We'll get these blow up of thunderstorms, but this may be it. Now that it's starting to get away from Cuba, still impacting here with the western part of Cuba. As it heads into the Gulf of Mexico, that shear has definitely let up and will only allow for favorable conditions and obviously the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. So there's a look at the track. Notice how quickly it is from right now to this time tomorrow. We could have a much stronger hurricane. Category 2, maybe even approaching Category 3 by the time we wake up on Wednesday morning. So the National Hurricane Center is actually hinting at that rapid intensification like we've seen with past storms, and really all of the ingredients are there for this to happen. Hopefully this is a worst case scenario. We know that they may even get stronger than that, but some of the guidance also keeping it below major hurricane strength. Either way, the impacts are going to be dangerous and potentially deadly here if people don't take this seriously. So let's walk you through where we've got hurricane warnings. That includes the Big Bend, the Nature Coast, and these go all the way up into parts of Thomas County, Brooks County, Lowndes County. You're under hurricane watch or hurricane warnings. Given the fact of the latest track, we could see those 75 80+ mile per hour gusts get into even the southern part of Georgia. I want to show you an idea of what the radar may look like as we go throughout the day tomorrow. Notice how far offshore the worst of the weather is. Now we'll start to get some of those outer rain bands. Some of those could have squally weather, maybe tropical storm force gusts, more severe like thunderstorm conditions. That's what we'll start to see. Higher wave action too in the southwest Florida coast. Again, spotty activity, but then we start to get these banding features coming through, and this is tomorrow dinner time, okay? And then watch the center of Idalia, much stronger by this point, perhaps a major hurricane. So Wednesday morning, perhaps a landfall. Notice that model taking it on the western side of that track. Same time, I want to show you the future radar for a different model on where it takes it, and notice how different the impacts would be for especially northern parts of Florida. This would be a worst case scenario for Gainesville, Cedar Key, Crystal River, and even the north side of the Tampa Bay Metro. Otherwise, Tallahassee and the Big Bend, St. Mark's could see the worst conditions. A lot to pan out and break down here on the Weather Channel. Remember to download the free Odyssey app so you can listen to the Weather Channel's live coverage.
Welcome back to our continuing coverage of Idalia. We'll have the next advisory, the new one, and the updated track here in the next 30 minutes from the National Hurricane Center in Miami. Meanwhile, mandatory evacuations are underway here on these coastal communities, primarily Zone A. That's the most vulnerable zone, and they may push those farther inland to zones B and C on Tuesday. It remains to be seen based on the latest track and forecast. And when Idalia makes that turn to the right, will impact how much surge we get here in the Tampa-St. Pete area. Right now, we're expecting a 4 to 7 foot surge above normally high ground. The mayor addressed the impacts and the preps and talked about safety today on the Weather Channel.
People in our community today have not experienced that in this particular area. And so we just continue that mantra of please be prepared. And you know that things have changed somewhat with the evacuations. Used to have everyone evacuate immediately from a community, and now we just let them know that you need to run from the water and hide from the wind.
Carl or Chris? And again, tonight, the airport is shutting down. We're not going to have any flights in and out of the airport tomorrow. No more flights. They're all canceled tomorrow. Meanwhile, the airport will try to get flights out on Wednesday. About 60% of the departures now have been canceled at Tampa International. And Carl, I think there's going to be a mass flux away from the coast at first light tomorrow morning. We did see a lot of traffic on 275 northbound coming from certainly St. Pete and those areas to the south. But tonight the causeway is relatively quiet, but we do expect a lot of folks hitting the road in the morning. The worst weather here moves in tomorrow evening into Wednesday. That's when we could get gusts in excess of 60 miles an hour, again, depending on the track, how many of those bands get us. It's those tropical rain bands where you get the strongest wind gusts, those squally rains and winds. And if they get farther east than forecast, we could have higher wind gusts and even more power outages.
And Mike, looking at conditions where you are right now, it is 86 degrees. The dew point is an astonishing 79 right now. And so it feels like 100 at 10:30 at night there in Tampa Bay. And that's a big part of why we're so concerned about the high end potential of this storm, because of all the available energy that's in the Gulf, and some of that air is, right over top of you right now.
And also the precipitable water, which is the amount of moisture in the column of air and how much can get squeezed out for rainfall. Now, fortunately, this thing is going to be moving at a pretty good clip, but we're still expecting some areas, and it may not be in Florida, it may be coastal Georgia and South Carolina, that could see double-digit rainfall totals. So, yeah, there's a lot of humidity. I didn't believe it. I can't believe it feels like 100 out here. It doesn't feel that warm, but if you say it is, I believe you. I trust you. You always have the stats.
Well, it's probably a little breezy there. Maybe that helps out a little bit. You always have a little bit of a wind on the coast there. Mike, thank you so much. Let's get a look at what's going on with the storm right now. It is a 70-mile-per-hour storm. As Mike mentions, we're expecting a brand new forecast package from the Hurricane Center by the top of the hour, so within 30 minutes. And the storm now moving north at 8 miles per hour. Like we saw last night, big burst of convection near the center of the storm. And it's not incredibly well formed from a satellite perspective today. There's been some shear that's been affecting the system, but that core is very much intact. And that's the important part. You've got this persistent, strong convection, several bursts of this over the last day or so near the core there. And so once that core gets into a better environment, we expect that it has all the potential in the world to take off. You look at the water temperatures here. They are way up there. 80 degrees is what is requisite for tropical cyclones. And here you've got, upper 80s, nearing 90 as you get towards the coast. And also, we're going to see some stronger winds aloft that may help to make the whole thing more efficient as it's nearing the coast. And so it is forecast to be a major hurricane as it's coming towards the coast. As we've talked about many, many times, that forecast track is showing you where the center of the circulation is likely to go, showing you the average forecast error over time here. But notice storm surge warnings well outside of that cone. And so by no means should you think in terms of being in or out of the the cone. That is almost irrelevant because you're going to see these impacts well outside of and especially to the right side of that circulation. More of an impact there in Tampa if it happens to be more towards the right side of that track, less impact in Tampa if it happens to be more to the left side of that track, and a lot to figure out yet. And the Weather Channel will stay on top of the threats 24/7 with the TWC streaming app. You can find updated alerts for the tropics. Go to streamtwc.com to get it for Roku, Amazon Fire, and Google TV.
Watch the Weather Channel for ongoing coverage of Idalia. Get trusted updates on the storm only on the Weather Channel.
All right, this was earlier today on Clearwater Beach. People and local city officials prepping, getting the lifeguard stations removed, because if you were to bring a substantial storm surge, those can get damaged, float away, and be an obstacle and even sort of debris for more damage up along, the promenade or some of the condos or resorts that you have there along the beach side. So they're trying to remove whatever they can to limit the ability for damage and loss, and that's what you should be doing as well. So hurricane warnings are up for Clearwater Beach as well as Pinellas County, the entire Tampa metro area north of the Sarasota County line. So Sarasota County down through Southwest Florida, you're under tropical storm warnings. Those extend into Central Florida, including Orlando, where you'll be dealing with tropical storm conditions, in Tallahassee, as well as areas there back towards the Big Bend of Florida under tropical storm warnings, hurricane warnings, all between the Big Bend and Tampa Bay, including Crystal River, Cedar Key, even into Gainesville and Valdosta. Lake City, another spot that could see upwards of hurricane force conditions. And again, it's going to depend on the exact track. The latest on tropical storm Idalia right now, still holding as a tropical storm. You can see that blow up of thunderstorm development, and it's kind of holding steady. So I don't think we'll see a lot in intensity changes with this latest advisory, but we have a lot of information. There are flights ongoing, and we'll continue to get this overnight and throughout the day tomorrow, even well ahead of Idalia, to get an idea of the atmospheric conditions and better forecasting for the models. And all that data then continues to be ingested, and the latest model guidance will then reflect those latest values. So the only change over as of the last advisory is the up ramp in intensity up to a strong major hurricane. We're talking about category 3 now is what the forecast is calling for. And there's a potential even, within 50 miles of the shore to get even stronger. So plan on that, especially if you live here over the Nature Coast, if you had plans to visit the Nature Coast, and even as far inland as Gainesville and Lake City. We've got to watch this because these are some substantial areas. In the north central part of the state, the heavier populated centers are back towards the I-75 corridor and not along the coast. There are some quaint seaside villages and smaller communities, but the majority of people live over in Ocala, Gainesville, and Lake City. And those are going to be spots that will see some significant impacts, not necessarily with storm surge because we're away from the water, but flash flooding and damaging wind, upwards of 60 to 100 miles per hour, perhaps, especially if the center were to move over your location. So we'll see where exactly that is. But this kind of gives you a flavor of how things evolve. We'll start to get those outer bands pushing up the Gulf Coast of Florida tomorrow afternoon. They really start to ramp up. And notice this one. Remember, too, starting tomorrow night, the water's going to start going up on the northeast part of the state. We don't want to forget about that, too. Coastal Georgia, a vulnerable spot. And so while the water rise there won't be as significant as what we'll see on the Gulf Coast of Florida, flooding up the St. Johns River, areas in Jacksonville, and also up towards like Jekyll Island, Tybee Island, could start as early as later tomorrow night.
Yeah, there's going to be a whole phase 2 of this thing going up the coast, and heavy rain along with all of that. And there's just a lot of people being affected by this storm. We wanted to focus in a little bit more on the storm surge since it is such a huge threat. You've got a terrible combination here with the most surge vulnerable section of coastline in the entire country, along with what is likely going going to be a significant storm. Category 3 is the current forecast from the Hurricane Center. We're expecting a new advisory within 20 minutes from the Hurricane Center. So there you see the values here. We're talking about life-threatening levels of storm surge, especially from the Nature Coast and on southward into the Tampa Bay area. And evacuations have been ordered for Zone A across much of the Tampa Bay area. I wanted to take a look at, first of all, the evacuation zones, and you see they're basically along all the beaches here, and then also along the bay as you get into the eastern part of St. Pete as well. And I also wanted to show you the current storm surge potential map. And so this is what we call the reasonable worst case scenario. So let's say the storm were to, in fact, be a Category 3 storm, and it were to come in 20 to 30 miles to the north of Tampa. Then we would be talking about maximizing the storm surge there. And so you're looking at potentially up to 6 feet of storm surge, maybe even above that, Anna Maria Island. And then farther north, you get up towards St. Pete Beach, and you see something very similar here. So a lot of these really beautiful beaches could be seriously impacted by storm surge if the storm comes in just to the north. And it's important that people living in vulnerable areas understand just how intense conditions can get. Here's Dr. Greg Postel to show you what storm surge can do.
Likely late Tuesday, early Wednesday, significant, indeed life-threatening storm surge will accompany landfall. Reasonable worst-case scenarios suggest we could see water rises and inundation above normally dry ground that exceed 9 feet. Let me show you what that looks like by bringing the water first up to about 6 feet. It's too late to do anything at this point. The only way out is to go up. Who knows what's floating in this water? There could be large objects, hazardous material. There is really no way to get around this. But we think there are going to be places that get above this and maybe even above 9 feet of storm surge. Now this is not survivable. So make sure that you follow the advice of the local officials and the National Hurricane Center. That may just save your life.
All right, Greg, thank you so much. And now also looking at the wind impacts, we expect that there's going to be potential for widespread power outages from the Big Bend area and then up into the northern part of the state. So that includes Gainesville and then into Jacksonville as well. You notice that power outages will be likely in Tampa and just northwest of Orlando. And also there will be potential for tornadoes, 3 out of 10 on the Torcon starting tomorrow morning and going through Wednesday morning. We'll have much more on this dangerous storm coming up in a moment.
Hundreds of millions of lives impacted.
Look at the wind howling through here.
Thousands of storms forecasted. 40 years of storytelling. And a former National Hurricane Center director. One trusted best-in-class expert team. America's most trusted news network. The Weather Channel.
Back here live in Tampa, I'm meteorologist Mike Seidel as we continue our coverage until 1 a.m. Eastern. Starting tomorrow morning at 5 a.m., we'll have Jim Cantori live from Cedar Key. And starting at 5 a.m. tomorrow, we'll be going around the clock at least through Wednesday into Thursday. So you know where to tune for the latest on from the National Hurricane Center on our expert analysis. We'll have Dr. Rick Knabb, former director of the Hurricane Center, back with us on Tuesday. Meanwhile, here in Tampa, mandatory evacuations kicked in this afternoon And I think a lot of folks are going to be heading for higher ground, certainly at first light tomorrow. We didn't see a lot of traffic today away from the coast, but we know the worst of the weather is going to hit here tomorrow evening into Wednesday. In fact, some of the highest wind gusts will likely be on Wednesday morning after the storm gets to our latitude and goes by us. Track is not etched in stone. That will determine the exact storm surge here in the Tampa Bay area. Right now, we're looking at 4 to 7 feet. And what we're waiting for right now is the latest advisory, Carl, from the National Hurricane Center. I haven't gotten it on my phone, but sometimes it gets to Atlanta faster via the airwaves. But we'll see if they've upgraded Idalia to a minimal hurricane and also get a new forecast track and see if they adjust that. I'm assuming, Carl, they won't adjust it very much, but every little wiggle left or right, east or west, affects the surge here in Tampa.
Yeah, that is the really big question, and made so much more difficult by the fact that the angle of attack is not terribly different from the angle of the west coast of Florida. So certainly we've got a lot to sort out in the next 24 hours. Mike, thank you. And let's take a look at the latest on the storm. Again, we're awaiting the new advisory. It's going to be coming in at any moment. As of the 7 p.m. Central Advisory, 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm moving to the north at 8 miles per hour. Again, the new advisory is going to be in just moments. We may be looking at a hurricane when it comes in. We've seen another big burst of convection near the center of circulation that's right along the western tip of Cuba. And, there's been a little bit of wind shear today. You can see how the high cloud kind of extends out to the south and to the east here, but you don't see much of it on the northwest side. It's been a little restricted because of stronger winds that are coming into the system. But the thinking is that that is going to begin to relent. And right as that is happening, it's also going to be working over exceptionally warm water in the Gulf of Mexico. So this is the forecast track and intensities as of the 7 p.m. advisory, and we'll see what happens with the new advisory when it comes in. But they've been forecasting a Category 3 hurricane with winds of 120 miles per hour, and you see where the guidance is here. And, it's more tightly clustered than it was yesterday. This is the European model ensemble guidance, more tightly clustered than it was yesterday, but there's still a spread there. And that spread extends from, Tampa or just north of Tampa, and then all the way across the Big Bend, the Nature Coast, all the way to Apalachicola. So there's still a range of possibilities in terms of where it's going to head, and that's going to have a big impact on the storm surge potential. And so if you think of the right front quadrant of the storm, so for example, let's imagine that our storm is coming in like this. So it's going to be on that right side where you're going to see that maximum storm surge potential. Yeah, obviously, if it's a little more towards Cedar Key and Tampa, that's really going to increase the storm surge potential in Tampa. If it's a little more towards Apalachicola and at Alligator Point, well, that's really going to increase the storm surge potential in the Big Bend area and may bring it down somewhat in Tampa. So track is still really important in terms of who gets what, along with the intensity of the storm. But it is a pretty good bet that we're going to be looking at a really significant storm developing during the day tomorrow. There you see the current zones, and we've got Zone A under mandatory evacuation all across the Tampa metro area. So that includes all of the beaches here, as well as the eastern part of St. Pete and all around Tampa Bay. And so, Chris, we're talking about a major undertaking here. I mean, there's a lot of people, millions of people in this metro area, and it's a really big deal to evacuate. But if we were to see 4 to 7 feet of surge in Tampa, you would not want to be anywhere near those zones.
That's more than we've seen in decades.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Some of the worst surge we've had in the Tampa Bay in more recent history has been about 4 feet. So think about that. If we were to get over that, that's very impactful, and in many cases, many of which have yet to even see with their own eyes in their neighborhood. So what the impacts would be really could be quite devastating there, not just in Tampa Bay, but even more so up the coast. So once you get up towards Crystal River and getting into Cedar Key and Steinhatchee and areas south of Tallahassee around St. Mark's. So there's a look at the timing. Again, we're within 36 to 40 hours away from landfall. hurricane warnings. We've got tropical storm warnings in red, and then the hurricane watches that go well inland and may even expand depending upon how quickly Idalia can strengthen over towards Jacksonville, where we could see hurricane force winds. All right, so winds stay fairly quiet overnight. Tomorrow morning's really your last window of opportunity to really take advantage of the quieter weather. By the afternoon, we start to get into those outer squalls. Overnight, tomorrow night is when winds really ramp up, and by Wednesday morning, we're in the thick of it here across Tampa Bay. Winds could gust upwards of 50 to 70 miles per hour. After the winds peak, that's where we're going to get the rush of water coming onshore, filling up the bay and the water rising. So that storm surge will be at its worst later on Wednesday into Thursday, and then we quiet things down. Storm surge warning, as mentioned, where we could see as high as 4 to 7 feet here across Tampa Bay. Idalia bringing intense wind and rain to Cuba today, and now the storm is moving into the Gulf of Mexico and headed to Florida, less than 40 to 48 hours away from landfall. And tonight, nearly 15.5 million people are under tropical alerts here from Florida into South Carolina. Preparations underway from sandbagging to stocking up on those supplies that you need here for the hurricane season. And that includes the Tampa Bay area, where we find our own Mike Seidel.
Preparations for Idalia are well underway here in the Tampa-St. Pete area. Mandatory evacuations kicked in Monday afternoon. There's a hurricane warning and a storm surge warning. We'll time out the impacts and when the worst weather will hit this area coming up. Chris?
I'm meteorologist Chris Bruin alongside storm specialist Carl Parker, live tonight until 1 a.m. Eastern, midnight Central Time. And concern growing tonight that we could see a major hurricane slamming into the Gulf Coast of Florida by the time we head into Wednesday morning. And Carl, we just got that latest advisory and the newest one from the National Hurricane Center. What has changed?
Well, not a lot of change here. We are still looking now at a 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm, and so it's on the verge of becoming a hurricane. Just not quite there yet. Still moving north at 8 miles per hour. The pressure 983 millibars. We have seen an addition of tropical storm warnings to the east coast of Florida as well as into the Georgia coast. We'll have that for you graphically coming up here in just a bit. I'm also going to show you the forecast track and intensities in just a moment here. I want you to take a look at the satellite picture, and you'll notice that there has been some restriction on the northwest side. So you see how there's high cloud that's kind of extending out to the south and to the east there. So that's where the storm is able to breathe, where that high cloud is kind of spreading out. But on the northwest side, there's been some restriction, and that's because there's an area of high pressure that is off to the west here, and so there's some shear associated with that, and that's also driving in a little bit of dry air as well. The thinking is that we're going to see less of that shear going forward, going through tomorrow. Shear is going to be less of an issue, and also the storm is going to be working over very, very warm water that is actually going to be getting warmer as it works farther to the north. And as the storm gets closer to the coast, there will be some stronger winds aloft that may actually help to strengthen the circulation. And so in terms of the broad strokes, they're pretty much the same from the National Hurricane Center, calling for there to be a major hurricane coming towards the coast very early on Wednesday morning. And for the most part, we've settled in on this idea of the storm taking aim on the Nature Coast, the Big Bend area of Florida. But, you know, keep in mind, there could be differences in terms of who gets what depending on where exactly it comes in. It's certainly, we're seeing a narrowing in terms of that average forecast error as we're getting closer in time. But there still would be a big difference from the right side of that cone to the left side of that cone. And then about a third of the time, the storm actually ends up being outside of the cone. So it's really important for you to not think in terms of the cone. You know, we hear that all the time. We hear people say, well, you know, I was in the cone or I wasn't in the cone, so I did X or I did Y. And you really don't want to think that way, because you can see right here that the cone is showing you this narrow area where the center is likely to be, but the impacts are going to be well outside of that center. Storm surge warnings extending well outside of where that center is. Storm surge watches even farther away down into the southwest coast of Florida that was hit so hard by Ian last year. here. So again, if it runs right down the middle, we're certainly going to be looking at a significant water level rise much farther to the south and east. If it were to be more to the right side and between Cedar Key and Tampa, that would maximize the surge there in the Tampa Bay metro area. That would give you the maximum potential surge, which now stands at about 4 to 7 feet. If it were be more to the left side of this track here and more towards Alligator Point and Apalachicola, well, that would bring down the potential for storm surge there in the Tampa Bay metro area. Right now, we're looking for 4 to 7 feet. That is the latest storm surge potential issued by the National Hurricane Center, 4 to 7 feet of surge in the Tampa Bay metro area. And so that's a life-threatening level of storm surge. That's why those mandatory evacuations were issued today, 6 to 9 feet to the north, 8 to 12 feet as you get up into the Big Bend region, and then to the south, 3 to 5 feet down towards Fort Myers Beach. So significant surge across an enormous area of coastline potentially, but the worst of it is going to be near the center and then a little to the south and to the east of the center as well. So where exactly the storm comes in is going to have a big impact on who gets the worst of the surge. Here you see the evacuation zones, and mandatory evacuations have been issued for zones A, and so that includes a lot of those coastal areas. And then this is also the storm surge potential from the National Hurricane Center. This is the reasonable worst case scenario. So if the center of the storm came in, say, 20 to 30 miles to the north of Tampa, that would bring in the maximum storm surge, particularly if we're talking about a very strong storm, a major hurricane. You could be looking at 6 feet of storm surge at St. Pete Beach and also into South Pasadena. And all of those areas are in Zone A. And that's why the mandatory evacuations have been issued for Zone A, because you've got that significant potential here. Same story farther north. Zone A includes Madeira Beach and Reddington Shores. And again here, we could be looking at up to 6 feet of storm surge potential, maybe even more than that, depending on exactly how the storm comes in. But then less of a threat if it does end up being farther north and west. And we want to go out now to our meteorologist, Mike Seidel. He is in Tampa tonight reporting on the impacts there, on the preparations there, I should say. And so, Mike, this is all about, the track. Mike, we're looking at, potential for very serious impacts there in Florida. And here's the latest from Mike Seidel.
Tonight we're standing along Old Tampa Bay, along the Courtney Campbell Causeway, not far from Tampa International Airport. The airport shutting down, no flights after midnight, and then tomorrow, Tuesday, no flights at all. Everything has been canceled. Wednesday right now, about 60% of departures have been scrubbed, so check with your airline. Meanwhile, preps are underway in the city of Tampa, including around Tampa General Hospital. Take a look at this. This is what we call the aqua fence. And what they do is they set this up. They set it up for Ian. They reset it up today around the hospital, and this really helps to keep any surge away from this very important structure. And the mayor addressed this earlier on Monday.
That is our Trauma One hospital in the city of Tampa, and it is located on Davis Islands, which is in a flood area. And so they purchased that fencing for the last storm season, so it hasn't been tried out yet. Hopefully, I hope that it's not tried out at all, but we'll see. It's a pretty fascinating approach to a storm surge by Tampa General Hospital.
Mandatory evacuations were issued and kicked in on Monday afternoon across Zones A in these coastal communities, including here in Hillsborough County and south around St. Pete and Pinellas County. A lot of folks may be waiting until tomorrow morning because the worst of the weather is not going to hit until late Tuesday into Wednesday. Not seeing a lot of traffic eastbound towards Tampa away from Clearwater Beach this evening. Meanwhile, hurricane warnings and storm surge warnings are up. We're expecting a surge of 4 to 7 feet, but that's all dependent on the track and the intensity of the hurricane Tuesday into Wednesday. I'm meteorologist Mike Seidel, the Weather Channel in Tampa.
Well, here's a live look at Cedar Key tonight, and a lot of lightning here. And, this could be, the main spot, Chris, where the storm comes in. And as you pointed out a number of times here, I actually went down into this region to see a tropical storm some time ago. And it's, difficult to get to the coast.
Yeah.
You know, it's not there. A lot of times there are these single lane roads, and they lead you to these, these individual spots. And so, to get out of there, were there to be significant surge, it's, going to be a tall order. And it also happens to be, pretty much the most surge vulnerable section of the Florida coastline. So, when you're talking about 7 or 10 or 11 or 12 feet of surge, I mean, that is not survivable.
Yeah.
You just can't live through that.
The city manager, I think, was interviewed earlier today, and I think Hermine was the last big surge event in Cedar Key. But it didn't have the wind like this could bring. So imagine having the type of surge, if not higher surge, and then the wind on top of that. So now you're bringing the waves that are much taller because of the higher winds on top of that surge.
Right.
And the impacts and destruction then is exponentially worse. And so the thunder you see right now, that's not associated with Idalia. It's giving you a nice kind of calm before the show kind of storm, as maybe this is your last night in town and then you're heading out in the morning, because there is a mandatory evacuation here in Levy County, and for good reason. This is a very isolated area. Cedar Key is 20 miles or more before you get to any nearby communities that can get you out. So that's something that we're watching really closely. It's not just there. You've got Keaton Beach. You've got some of these little beach towns, and they're not sandy beaches. They're more like marshlands. So think of coastal Louisiana. Think of the low country coast of South Carolina. That's what it looks like north of Tampa, and then also into the Big Bend area of Florida. Now, the one change that we have with the latest advisory is that red now encompasses all of the northeast and central part of Florida. So Daytona Beach, Jacksonville, parts of St. Simons, Georgia, you're under now a tropical storm warning. So we've gone from watch to warning there. Valdosta under a hurricane warning. Gainesville, Florida under a hurricane warning. So the hurricane force winds are going to go well inland. And remember, that's where your heaviest population centers are. They're not along the coast in north central Florida. They're back towards I-75. And while we won't have to worry about storm surge there, inland flooding and then heavy high winds are going to be a big factor. And right now, if the center of the track were to be where the Idalia were to make landfall, that would bring some of the worst conditions and that onshore push into Cedar Key. By the way, this area is prone to flooding versus different spots. The river basins are more like what you see into the south versus into Florida. So the Suwannee River Basin could see a quick rise on those river bodies as you're bringing in that surge. So we could see some significant flash flooding, especially when you're talking 6 to 8 inches of rain. In Tampa particularly, the highest totals will be closer to the coast. Winds ramp up as we get into tomorrow evening, and then by tomorrow night, we start to get into those 40 to 60 mile per hour winds. They'll start offshore, so we don't expect too much coastal flooding or storm surge, at least along the beaches or along most parts of the bay. It depends on what part of the bay you're on. It's really after the winds peak that we get that predominant shift from the southwest, and that's when we're going to see the highest water rise here in Tampa Bay. So that's a later Wednesday into Wednesday night and Thursday morning, and then after that, things really then wind down. But really concerned about North Florida here, Carl. Not only could we see over a half foot of rainfall, but this is where we could get into those 100+ mile per hour winds. And while the core will be relatively small, it's gonna make it quite a bit, because again, it's very marshy here, so it'll take a little while for those winds to kind of wind down, and it will have opportunity to get into some of these major north central Florida cities like Lake City, Gainesville, even Valdosta, Georgia, depending upon where it comes ashore and where that core then ends up going over.
Yeah, there's actually been research on that point. It's called the brown ocean. When you've got a lot of swampy terrain, that too can feed energy into a storm, just the way that the ocean does. And we wanted to talk a little bit more about surge and the concerns here. Again, here are the evacuation zones in the Tampa Bay area. Zone A under a mandatory evacuation. And so all those areas along the beaches there, and then into St. Petersburg, and then southward, those areas all under mandatory evacuation. And we wanted to show you one location in particular. This is Gulfport, and that is south of St. Pete and near 275. And so, what are we talking about when we're talking about potentially 6 feet of surge in those areas? Well, That is a really big deal when you get that level of surge. And in fact, we can show you storm surge potential from that region. Take a look here. This is the storm surge potential in St. Pete Beach, and you see up to 6 feet of storm surge potential. This is the reasonable worst case scenario. This is if the storm comes in just to the north. And so looking at Gulfport here, this is what would happen if we were to get that 6 feet of surge. And remember, this is not necessarily going to be standing water. We're also going to be talking about wave action on top of this, a lot of flow in the water. And, you know, again, once you're getting to 6 feet of water level rise, it's not survivable unless you can manage to evacuate vertically. If you can get up into a building that has multiple stories, that's about the only way you're going to be able to get through an event like this. And so it is really, really important to listen to your local officials and to take those warnings very seriously and to get away from the coast. You don't have to go terribly far in a lot of cases. You just have to get out of those zones and to higher ground, and that will be enough. You run from the water and you hide from the wind. As long as you're in a sturdy structure, you're probably going to be in good shape for the most part with respect to the wind. But with the water, that is the big killer. That storm surge is a huge killer. And in fact, most fatalities are related to storm surge flooding and also inland flooding. 75% fatalities are related to that type of flooding. So please, please listen to your local officials. Take those warnings and those evacuation orders very seriously. And stay with the Weather Channel. We're going to have much more coverage. Our team of meteorologists and reporters are spread out to cover every angle of this storm like no one else can. We'll have much more on the latest advisory from the National Hurricane Center.
Well, preparations underway tonight in parts of Florida, Georgia, and into the Carolinas. We have hurricane and tropical storm warnings and watches up that don't just include Florida, but go well into Georgia now and South Carolina. Nearly 15.5 million under those tropical alerts. And in the town of St. Mark's, Florida, that's just south of Tallahassee, a very vulnerable but beautiful spot right on the Gulf of Mexico in northern Florida. Our Charles Peak talked to the owner of a restaurant that sits on the Waukulla River. Stanley West has been through several hurricanes before and told our Charles Peak what he plans to do when it comes to Idalia. And he looks at the unique way he tracks the impacts from past storms.
This is my poll of hurricanes over 28 years worth. We have had Michael, which is way up here. We have had Dennis, which is down here. We've had Earl, we've had Hermine, we've had Gustav, we've had Ivan, Opal. We've had a lot of hurricanes come through here. We're kind of prepared mostly. We get ready, we watch, and then we all of a sudden do what we got to do to either get ready or kind of just wait. And right now we're in the wait game because we don't know what it's going to do right this minute. They kind of are leaning towards it going a little south of us, which is really good for us. So we're kind of watching right now because we know that the west side is a little bit more gentle than the east side. The east side is where it throws it up in and brings it all out of here. The last time it happened for us, we lost all our river. It went all the way down to a trickle down in the bottom of this river, which is a big, deep river. So we know that we're on the good side of it right this minute. So we're hoping it doesn't do a jog, which they've been known to do. That's how we got Dennis. Dennis turned from Pensacola and came all the way over here and threw all that water at us. So we're keeping our fingers crossed and watching.
What is your preparation if it moves a little to the west and you're going to get the bad side?
If it moves a little to the west, we got a big old bus and we'll start loading everything up and getting as much out of here as we can and salvage what we can, and then we'll come back and wash it out and start over. We are set up for being able to wash the place down and get back up in business pretty dang quick. So we get ready for hurricanes. We know what hurricanes are. We live in Florida, and this is it.
All right, well, let's get the latest now on Tropical Storm Idalia. As of the latest advisory, it just came in just a few minutes ago at 11 p.m. It's still holding as a tropical storm right now, and it's trying to get better organized. It's, the development we had earlier today, well, that's kind of passed well now to the south of the center, and now we're getting a new blow up of activity here around the center. So it's trying to reorganize. We've had some shear, which has kept this northwestern side from kind of breathing like you see here on the south and eastern side of the center. But we expect all of this to change as it moves into the Gulf of Mexico, which will allow for rapid intensification. So just because it's a tropical storm, it's stayed that way now for almost 48 hours. The next 48 hours, boy, is this going to be a whole different story for Idalia. Really quickly, the latest track hasn't really changed a whole lot. Again, looking at the nature coast, really just from between St. Mark's and, say, Crystal River. That looks to be the best. But remember, the impacts are going to be drastically different versus it takes the left side of the cone and the right side of the cone. So I want to show you a couple of the different model runs and how they compare. First, we'll start with where the hurricane warnings are. Essentially, I-75, kind of the dividing line. West of there is where you've got your hurricane warnings. That includes Columbia County here around Lake City, western Alachua County, western Marion County, getting over towards Cedar Key, and all of these coastal communities back from St. Mark's and then all the way down to the Tampa Bay metro area. On the east coast of Florida, Jacksonville, Daytona Beach, St. Augustine, you're under tropical storm warnings now. So that's been new as of the 11 p.m. advisory. We've got some thunderstorms offshore not associated with Idalia tonight. Tomorrow, we start to get those outer bands. That tropical moisture makes it in, and there's the center. Now, this is just gives you a flavor of what it may look like here by 8 p.m. tomorrow. Notice the center still within 100 miles or so from the west coast of Florida, maybe even more like 200 miles away. We'll see. It could take this side, or it could be closer to the coast, which would certainly ramp up our impacts. But note, later tomorrow, things start to go downhill very quickly, especially across southwestern Florida, at least with tropical storm force winds. Then look at that. This model has it coming in right south of Tallahassee in the Big Bend of Florida. So close-up view, this modeled path takes it on the left side of the cone, which would have devastating effects here for the nature coast, mainly north of Cedar Key. We'll have a huge push of water, but that core winds will be confined. This would be a worst-case scenario for places like Tallahassee. Notice Gainesville, Crystal River on the east side of the cone. Some of the models wanting to bring that more like that, which would be a worst-case scenario for Gainesville and areas, say, around north of Tampa Bay up towards Crystal River. So a lot to dissect. We're going to break things down here with the forecast. And remember to download the free Odyssey app.
Storm preps ahead of Idalia got underway on Monday across the Tampa-St. Pete area. Mandatory evacuations were issued. Many of them kicked in early Monday afternoon. Some hotels asked their guests to leave immediately. We're fortunate at our hotel we have until noon on Tuesday. That's when the worst of the weather will start moving in. Later Tuesday afternoon into Wednesday, we expect wind gusts to peak at about 60 miles an hour in the Tampa-St. Pete area. Now, that's all dependent on the track of the storm and how strong it is as it gets up into this part of the Gulf of Mexico. And the mayor of Tampa spoke about those impacts earlier on Monday.
Although we haven't been hit in a century, we continue to prepare and take these storms very, very seriously. We've put out an emergency order. Shelters are opening, called for evacuations in our lower lying areas, reminding our residents to be prepared and letting them know that we are prepared as a city to meet the needs if, in fact, we are hit by the hurricane.
One of the biggest travel impacts in the area on Tuesday will be at Tampa International Airport. It's just down the causeway behind me. All flights have been canceled on Tuesday. And looking ahead to Wednesday as the storm pulls away, right now about 60% of departures have already been scrubbed. As far as schools go, they're closed Tuesday and Wednesday. Many of them hope to reopen on Thursday. Many of them are used as hurricane shelters. I'm meteorologist Mike Seidel in Tampa.
All right, Mike, thank you. We have a new advisory from the National Hurricane Center as of the top of the hour, and we are still looking at a tropical storm, 70-mile-per-hour wind right now, and it's moving north at 8 miles per hour. And so it has been fighting some shear a little bit today, but we think that that shear is going to lessen, and it's still on track to become a significant storm going into tomorrow. Major hurricane approaching the coast by late tomorrow and into Wednesday. Some changes with this advisory. The update here including tropical storm warnings now for the east coast of Florida, and hurricane warnings all the way up here into Valdosta. We had hurricane watches into the north central part of the state. Those have been converted to hurricane warnings, and tropical storm watches now extending up into the Georgia coast and into the coast of South Carolina as well. Going to be a significant storm in those areas. So here's the new forecast track and intensities from the Hurricane Center, looking for the storm to be up to around 105 miles per hour. So category 2 by this time tomorrow, and then by very early Wednesday, major hurricane approaching the Big Bend area of Florida. But we still, have some potential for some wiggle room here in terms of exactly where it's going to come on board. If it happens to come in just north of Tampa, that would maximize the storm surge threat there in Tampa. If it's more to the left side of the cone, then we'd see a little less of a threat there in Tampa. But regardless, someone is going to be in for a significant surge event with this storm because it is a very strong storm and because there's an exceptionally vulnerable section of coastline in that region of the country. There's a look at the satellite picture. Big burst of thunderstorms. Again, some restriction on the northwest side here because of the shear that's been ongoing there. But look at the water temperatures along the path of this storm. They are in the upper 80s. So there is a terrific amount of potential energy in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see what that can do in an optimal situation by looking at Hurricane Franklin, which I'll show you in just a second. There you see the storm surge potential. Now, exactly where that is realized is going to depend on the track of the storm. But we think that someone there along the western Gulf, along the western side of Florida, the Gulf Coast of Florida, is going to be in for some significant wind. And here's a look at the area of strong winds. And this is a product from the National Hurricane Center. So that begins to move in by tomorrow night, starts to really press into the west central part of the state into the overnight hours. And then that hurricane force wind comes on board into the early morning and will pass through the north central part of the state and towards Jacksonville as well, and then maybe up into Savannah and into Charleston. So power outages are going to be widespread, most likely from the Big Bend region up into Jacksonville. Significant tree and power line damage in those areas. There is also going to be a threat for tornadoes. We've got a 3 out of 10 on the Torcon in the west central part of Florida. So a lot of hazards here. And then on top of all that, very heavy rain coming up through Georgia and the Carolinas. So the flash flood potential is also going to be very high. North central Florida included on that. Very quickly want to show you Hurricane Franklin. It is a category 4, very nearly a category 5. Look at the structure on that thing. Look at that well-formed eye right there. It is going to be passing to the west of Bermuda, and it's going to be well to the east of the east coast of the U.S., but it will produce very large waves, and those large waves getting towards the coast tomorrow afternoon. So a significant rip current threat along those east coast beaches tomorrow and going into Wednesday as well as a result of this very powerful storm. We'll have much more coming up. Stay with us.
My active psoriatic arthritis.
Channel for ongoing coverage of Idalia. Get trusted updates on the storm only on the Weather Channel.
Well, people living in the Tampa area are busy gearing up for heavy rain, storm surge flooding, and high winds. Many of them actually spent the day filling up sandbags. It's just a glimpse as to what Floridians are doing over the past 24, 48 hours, and will continue to do into the first half of your day on Tuesday. Let's get you the latest here on Tropical Storm Idalia. Still a tropical storm, has yet to make it that hurricane status, but that will happen here shortly. And don't be surprised to wake up and have a much stronger storm on our hands, likely a hurricane by the morning. And by this time tomorrow, we could be dealing with a strong Category 2, perhaps major hurricane as it is pushing through the Gulf of Mexico. So pressure still staying steady at 983 millibars, moving to the north at about 8 miles per hour. We do expect that speed to pick up a little bit as it gets kind of pulled to the north and then curve along the southeastern coast. And then beyond that, it does appear it will weaken off the coast of the Carolinas. And then the models want to just kind of meander it out over the Atlantic, not really strengthening it a whole lot, but could bring in some increased tropical moisture as it continues to just kind of linger there. Regardless as to what it does over the course of the 7-day period, let's look at the next 2 days, because this is when we expect the worst conditions to arrive. And guys, this is going to be a very impactful storm for some areas that haven't seen a storm of this magnitude, or maybe you have never witnessed a storm of this magnitude in your location, particularly places like Cedar Key. What this could do to some of these larger cities along the I-75 corridor, like Lake City and Gainesville, could be substantial, especially with the tree canopy we have here, huge oak trees, pine trees. And when you talk about a massive hurricane that could exceed a major hurricane status, those winds will continue. They will weaken somewhat. We won't see maybe 120 mile per hour gusts like we will along the coastal areas, but we could see winds as high as 100 miles per hour or higher in gusts, even as far north as Valdosta, Georgia. Now, again, not everyone will see that, but the warnings are up, and it's really dependent upon, does it take a more westerly track or come in more towards the east. But a lot of that will kind of be worked out as we get throughout the day tomorrow. I want to show you what the high resolution future radar will look like as we go into your Tuesday. The morning, relatively quiet. We're going to get some feeder bands, some of these outer squalls to start to impact the western Keys as well as southwest Florida. Squally weather, so heavy thunderstorms, some gusts that could exceed 40, 50 miles per hour. They'll last for an hour or two, then things will wind down. So hit and miss thunderstorms, still quiet in central Florida, still quiet in North Florida, at least through lunchtime. There's Idalia, at this point, much stronger hurricane, moving up into the northern Gulf by tomorrow night and then making landfall on Wednesday morning. Now, will it be over the Big Bend? Will it be here? That's going to have drastic impacts, because the farther it stays away, the better we are in places like Tampa Bay as it comes to storm surge. But notice that onshore push, Carl. So it's really when the center gets north of Tampa, after the winds have already kind of peaked, is when we'll have the highest water rise in Tampa Bay and Clearwater, St. Pete, and areas there in central Florida.
Yeah, we're certainly looking for a prolonged period of water level rise there along the west coast of Florida. And I want to show you what the cone is doing relative to where the storm surge warnings and watches are, because we've been trying to hammer this point home for a long time now. People often talk about being in or out of the cone, and being in or out of the cone often really isn't that relevant in terms of what impacts you're going to get. You can be out of the cone, as you are in Tampa, and still get a really significant storm surge there that could cause life-threatening flooding. That is the worry, especially south and east of the center of circulation. Now, if the center is closer to Tampa, more between Cedar Key and Tampa, well, that obviously is going to maximize the surge in Tampa. If it were more to the left side of this track here, then that would bring it down somewhat, but it would still be devastating for the Big Bend area of Florida. And I want to show you the storm surge potential. This is the reasonable worst case scenario. So you see the water coming well inland here along the Nature Coast in the Big Bend area, and want to drop on down to Cedar Key, where a mandatory evacuation is in place. We are hearing that there are people who have decided not to leave Cedar Key, and when you look at the storm surge potential, you see that it is above 9 feet across parts of Cedar Key. Folks, that means water everywhere with wave action, with very strong wind. That would be very, very difficult to survive. Maybe if you were in a larger building, multi-story building, you'd have a shot. But if you were in a one-story building, I just don't know how you'd get through that if we saw that level of storm surge. So please, please take these orders very seriously when you are asked to leave. Let's take a look at some other storm surge potential areas here. We'll drop on down into Tampa Bay. And so this is based on the latest modeling here. And this is, assuming the very worst case scenario once again. So if the storm were to come in, say, 30 miles to the north of Tampa Bay, that would bring us the worst case scenario for Tampa Bay. And you see the storm surge here up to around 6 feet potentially on Anna Maria Island west of Sarasota and Bradenton. That's a really big deal, getting up to 6 feet of storm surge. Again, that is life-threatening storm surge. Similar story here in St. Pete Beach and getting up into Boca Ciega. Again, widespread areas of 6 feet of storm surge. But you notice we've got no potential for storm surge near downtown St. Petersburg. So you wouldn't have to go very far to get away from that threat for high water. Remember, run from the water, hide from the wind. If you're on the coast and you've been asked to evacuate, you need to take it very seriously because this is going to be a significant storm. We'll have much more on the storm coming up in a few minutes.
I'm your football.
Welcome back to our coverage of Idalia, which is now still a tropical storm as of the 11 p.m. Eastern advisory. It's on the cusp of becoming a hurricane, probably will do so overnight or tomorrow morning. It has been undergoing a little bit of wind shear today, but it's going to be moving into an increasingly favorable environment. And the thinking is that it's probably going to take off once it moves up into the eastern Gulf of Mexico. You look at the satellite presentation, you notice how there's high cloud that's kind of fanning out off to the south into the east here. And so that is what we call outflow, and that's indicative of where we're seeing evacuation of mass. So the model of a tropical cyclone is for warm and humid air to come in near the bottom, and then that rises up through thunderstorms, and then it spreads out at the top. That's called the outflow, and the outflow needs a channel. It needs a place to go, and that's what we've got here on the south and east side. We don't have that on the northwest side because there's been some stronger wind aloft driving down into the circulation. So we call that restricting the outflow. And if the storm can't produce that outflow all around, that tends to hold back the intensity a little bit. But the thinking is that that shear is going to go away. And as it's going away, it's also going to work up into incredibly warm water with water temperatures in the upper 80s. In the eastern part of the Gulf. 80 is what is needed generally for a tropical cyclone. You're getting up to near 90 in the northeast part of the Gulf. And so there is a ton of available energy for this thing. One of the big questions still is where exactly is it going to go? You see the range of possibilities here in the European ensemble members where they changed the model a little bit and run it 51 times to account for errors getting into the model. So we're still not precisely sure of where it's going to be headed, but we know that it's going to be coming generally into the Big Bend area of Florida. In fact, I want to go back just a second here and show you the latest forecast track and intensities from the Hurricane Center. So it is expected to be a major hurricane right before it's coming in, and that's right in there. So that's very early on Wednesday morning. 120 mile per hour storm, really significant hurricane, possibly moving towards the Big Bend area, but it could be very close to Tampa, and that's important to figure that out, because if it does end up moving in just north of Tampa, well, that would cause really significant storm surge flooding, and that's why local officials did go ahead and issue the mandatory evacuations for Zone A across a lot of the regions, some other zones and some other circumstances as well, but generally Zone A has been evacuated in the area, and we wanted to take a look at the storm surge potential in this area. So, if you do have a major hurricane that comes in not terribly far to the north of Tampa, say 30 miles to the north of Tampa, that would maximize the surge. And so that's what this model reflects. How bad could it be? What is within the realm of possibility? And so you're talking about, 6 feet of surge on St. Pete Beach, and then farther north as well. So, these are areas that are very much within that Zone A evacuation zone. But notice, as you get farther inland here, we get into other zones, Zone B, and then there's Zone D, and then Zone E in the purple. By the time you get to the center of St. Petersburg, you're in good shape. So you wouldn't have to go inland very far to make sure you're not in that area where you'd be affected by the very worst of the surge. Just a little bit of an evacuation inland would go a long way here. And then the same story as you get farther north, Reddington, Madeira, all in that Zone A. And so, that's the thing that we really want people to know, because we know that during Ian, there were cases where people said, well, we had a hurricane before, we had Charlie, and it didn't do that much. Well, Charlie was a small storm, and they don't tend to produce a lot of surge, generally speaking. So it's really difficult for you to use your own frame of reference sometimes as a way to decide things, because maybe you've never been through anything like this before.
Yeah. There were accounts of, you mentioned a storm going just north of Tampa Bay back in the 1920s.
Yes.
There was a hurricane that hit Tarpon Springs. And, Tampa at that point was just a small community.
Right.
So they had significant storm surge at that point. But imagine now if that similar setup would happen and what that would cause.
So much more infrastructure that has not been tested, and, many, many people that have not had that experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's certainly something we've got to watch. While that may not be the most, likely scenario, it certainly is a possibility, and you want to plan for that, because once we get those last minute, tweaks to the forecast, it's too late to then evacuate. Things are already going downhill this time tomorrow night. So there's a look at the forecast. We talked a lot about Florida. We want to briefly talk about beyond Florida and what happens after it makes landfall, because those tropical storm watches, they extend well now up into South Carolina, expanding north of Charleston, Savannah, Hilton Head, Jekyll Island. You're under those tropical storm watches. And in fact, we may also have some of the heaviest rainfall, obviously near landfall, but also back over towards eastern Georgia, like Savannah and the low country coast of South Carolina, upwards of 5 to even 8 inches. That's the European model. The latest GFS, again, keeping this just off to the west, which puts that rain path a little farther inland and away from the coast. But the exact track of that's going to be yet to be determined. Expect some significant flooding, possibly from Columbia south towards Charleston, where that center makes a landfall and then tracks up the coast from there. But heavy rain, this will be on Wednesday night into Thursday, where we see the worst impacts for the Grand Strand, for the low country coast, South Carolina, and eastern North Carolina. Idalia bringing intense wind and rain to Cuba today, and now the storm is tracking towards Florida, less than 48 hours away. And tonight, nearly 15.5 million people are under tropical alerts from central Florida into the southern part of South Carolina. Georgia included in that as well. People have been filling up sandbags, stocking up on supplies, and that includes the Tampa Bay area, where we find meteorologist Mike Seidel.
Preparations for Idalia are well underway here in the Tampa-St. Pete area. Mandatory evacuations kicked in Monday afternoon. There's a hurricane warning and a storm surge warning. We'll time out the impacts and when the worst weather will hit this area coming up. Chris?
And I'm meteorologist Chris Bruin alongside storm specialist Carl Parker, live tonight until 1 a.m. Eastern, midnight Central Time. Concern growing tonight that we could see a major hurricane slam the Gulf Coast of Florida. And Carl, we saw in the latest advisory not a whole lot of change. And the concern is, this has been a tropical storm for a while. People may be questioning how quickly can this intensify once it gets close to Florida and into the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, exactly right, Chris. When you're talking about it, this from a social science perspective, that is something that I would be concerned about. Whether or not, people are going to bed and saying, well, it's a tropical storm, we don't know what it's going to do tomorrow. There's a really good shot that this thing is going to become a monster by tomorrow because it's been undergoing some shear through the course of the day today. That shear is most likely going to lessen, but then on top of that, it's going to work out over exceptionally warm water. And by the time it gets into the northern Gulf, it's going to be in a position where upper level winds are probably going to enhance the circulation. And so for a lot of different reasons, things can change very, very quickly. And, rapid intensification is, every bit on the table in this situation. We could see this thing just turn around really quickly. We could wake up tomorrow morning and it could be a different story. Again, looking at it from a satellite perspective, you see that there's been some high cloud here coming off the top, outflow as we call it, moving down towards the south and towards the east as well. It's been a little more restricted on the northwest side because there's been some shear there, and I think that's been holding it back a little bit. But there's this really healthy bursting of thunderstorms near that center of circulation. That core is very much intact. So even though it's not the most impressive satellite presentation right now, that could change in a moment. When you've got a really intact core like that, working over exceptionally warm water, and the upper level environment starts to relax a little bit to allow it to breathe a little bit more, this thing could turn around on a dime here. And in fact, if you look real closely, you see what look like fingers there. In fact, I'm going to stop this so you can see it. You see what look like fingers right in there? Those are called transverse bands. And, that happens when you've had a tremendous bursting of thunderstorms near the top of the storm, and then you actually have parts of the cloud that are trying to find their way out. And so you get these little fingers that develop. See that right in there? That is usually a sign of intensification. So, we might be right on the edge of this thing beginning to turn around here. So, my whole point in all of this is don't say, oh, it's a tropical storm. Maybe it's not going to do that much. It is most likely going to be a really significant storm. Again, there's been some shear coming around an area of high pressure here today, some drier air potentially coming in as well. But look at the water temperatures into the eastern Gulf. 80 is what is requisite. And here you've got upper 80s to near 90 degrees. You've got a tremendous amount of energy, potential energy in those waters. And that storm is going to be coming up through that environment. And again, some really strong winds just to the north as it's getting towards the northern Gulf. That will likely also help to enhance the strength of the circulation. So for a lot of different reasons, it is felt that it is going to be a major hurricane. That is the forecast from the National Hurricane Center. And so a major hurricane coming up into this incredibly surge vulnerable section of the coastline, the most surge vulnerable section of coastline in the entire country. Because of the continental shelf. There's a very shallow continental shelf that is all along here, and so it's a lot easier for a storm to pile up the water because there's not much depth to the ocean in the eastern part of the Gulf. And so that's why those storm surge warnings extend well outside of where the center is going to be. That's what the cone is telling you, where the center is going to be. And those storm surge warnings and watches extend well to the south and to the east because there's going to be this potential for a really significant surge event, which may bring life-threatening surge into the Tampa Bay area. That's why the evacuation orders have been issued. It is almost certainly going to do that up the coast there into the Nature Coast and the Big Bend area as well. Really big problems potentially with surge. And, with Tampa, it's going to depend on exactly where it comes in. Maybe a little less if it's farther to the northwest, more towards Alligator Point in Apalachicola. But if it's just to the north of Tampa, this could be one of the worst storms you've seen in a very long time. there in Tampa because of the intensity and because of the nature of the coastline. Hurricane warnings are up from Tampa and on northward. Significant wind potential as well into Gainesville, into Valdosta. A lot of trees in this part of Florida. They're going to be coming down. Power lines are going to be coming down. Tropical storm watch is also up into the Georgia, South Carolina coast. And this is a look at what we call the wind field, the area of strong winds. So those tropical storm force winds start to come in tomorrow evening around this time. So you don't have that much time. I mean, you don't want to be making preparations while the wind is moving in. You have to have that completed long before the wind starts. And that's going to be 24 hours from now or less on some parts of the coast. That continues then to move in, going into midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. There you see the area of hurricane force winds right in there. And as we go farther into Wednesday morning, again, hurricane force winds near the center there. Very strong winds in that red area, winds overspreading the north and central part of the state, and then getting up into Gainesville and getting into Jacksonville and eventually coming towards Savannah and Charleston as well. So there's going to be a large area of impacts where you see widespread power outages from just north of Tampa, potentially into Cedar Key and Gainesville and Jacksonville, and then likely power outages from Tampa towards Orlando, and then from Tallahassee over to Savannah and into Charleston. And also there's going to be potential for tornadoes. We're talking about a 3 out of 10 on the Torcon. That is always a worry when you've got a landfalling tropical cyclone that you might see tornadoes. And then beyond that, storm continues to move up here and along the coast. Now, again, looking at this track, if it's more towards the right side of this track, that means it comes out over the open water once again. And that means that that will have an impact on the intensity of the storm. If the center is out over the warm water of the Southeast Atlantic, that could make it a stronger storm. That would increase the coastal impacts there in coastal North and South Carolina. Maybe that it travels right along the coast there, and as it does so, it's going to produce a terrific amount of rain. So if you think about what's going on here in Northwest Florida, you've got the storm pushing the water into the coast in Northwest Florida in the Big Bend area. You've
Zones A in these coastal communities, including here in Hillsborough County and south around St. Pete and Pinellas County. A lot of folks may be waiting until tomorrow morning because the worst of the weather is not going to hit until late Tuesday into Wednesday. Not seeing a lot of traffic eastbound towards Tampa away from Clearwater Beach this evening. Meanwhile, hurricane warnings and storm surge warnings are up. We're expecting a surge of 4 to 7 feet. But that's all dependent on the track and the intensity of the hurricane Tuesday into Wednesday. I'm meteorologist Mike.
To evacuate to a second or third floor, I mean, even a second floor might not be enough. I would absolutely not want to be on Cedar Key with this storm coming in. We'll talk more about storm surge and all the impacts in just a few minutes.
Well, preparations underway tonight in parts of Florida, Georgia, and also into the Carolinas, because Idalia is not going to stop in Florida. It's going to continue up the southeast coast, and we're going to have impacts well up the shoreline. Tropical storm warnings and watches include much of Florida, as well as hurricane warnings now for Tampa Bay up through the Big Bend. We're talking nearly 15.5 million folks under those tropical alerts. And in the town of St. Mark's, Florida, that's just south of Tallahassee, our Charles Peak talked to the owner of a restaurant that sits on the Waukulla River. Stanley West has been through several hurricanes before and told our Charles Peak what he plans to do when it comes to Idalia, and he looks at the unique way he tracks the impacts from past storms.
This is my poll of hurricanes, over 28 years worth. We have had Michael, which is way up here. We have had Dennis, which is down here. We've had Earl, we've had Hermine, we've had Gustav, we've had Ivan, Opal. We've had a lot of hurricanes come through here. We're kind of prepared mostly. We get ready, we watch, and then we all of a sudden do what we got to do to either get ready or kind of just wait. And right now we're in the wait game because we don't know what it's going to do right this minute. They kind of are leaning towards it going a little south of us, which is really good for us. So we're kind of watching right now because we know that the west side is a little bit more gentle than the east side. The east side is where it throws it up in and brings it all out of here. The last time it happened for us, we lost all our river. It went all the way down to a trickle down in the bottom of this river, which is a big, deep river. So we know that we're on the good side of it right this minute. So we're hoping it doesn't do a jog, which they've been known to do. That's how we got Dennis. Dennis turned from Pensacola and came all the way over here and threw all that water at us. So we're keeping our fingers crossed and watching.
What is your preparation if it moves a little to the west and you're going to get the bad side?
If it moves a little to the west, we got a big old bus and we'll start loading everything up and getting as much out of here as we can and salvage what we can, and then we'll come back and wash it out and start over. We are set up for being able to wash the place down and get back up in business pretty dang quick. So we get ready for hurricanes. We know what hurricanes are. We live in Florida, and this is it.
Now that we're into the late nights, still holding on to a tropical storm status. Hasn't yet taken on that hurricane-like look from the enhanced satellite, and also not finding those hurricane gusts just quite yet. Hurricane hunters have been out in this. They've been flying multiple flights at a time and flying in unique patterns, really trying to get the best data for the models to then ingest and give us the most updated, most accurate forecasts. And we've seen changes in the intensity on what's to come, because really from now up through landfall, it's got a perfect environment almost. Very warm waters in the Gulf of Mexico. It's got room to breathe, and that shear that's been keeping it at bay, along with the land interaction here between Mexico and Cuba, that's all going to be going away. So it's anticipated, and it would be shocking if it didn't rapidly intensify as it pushed into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's why we need to be prepared. Really quickly, let's show you the path, because I want to take a look at some of the different scenarios here. But notice it's still bringing it up towards that nature coast between the Big Bend and north of Tampa. Then skirting the coast or moving just inland up I-95 in through the Carolinas, eastern Georgia, and then pulling off towards the east, maybe even impacting Bermuda. But of course, the intensity much weaker by that point as it kind of just meanders there off the southeast coast. We talked about the warnings. We talked about some of the tropical storm watches. I want to play a visual. This is just an idea. This is not exactly how it's going to unfold. This is just one computer model, and it gives you a future radar kind of visual as to how things will evolve on your Tuesday. Notice those outer bands really ramping up, and notice we tighten that gradient, so we squeeze out all these moisture bands north of the center, so well up towards the panhandle. So things can get quite active later in the afternoon and into the evening tomorrow along that I-10 corridor. Notice Central Florida fairly quiet, as well as the southeast parts of Florida. But we'll get some of these outer squalls too to come into southwest Florida, and those could bring in some strong gusty winds. By Wednesday morning, that's where we're looking at landfall, and then you get that onshore push as that wraparound push of moisture continues to pummel some of these places like Tampa Bay, like the southwest parts of Florida. So notice this model guidance is on the far left side of the cone. That would be more of a worst case scenario for Tallahassee and areas into southern Georgia. Much better situation in Gainesville and Tampa, because it would be farther removed from the highest winds. Now, take that computer model and overlay it with another computer model, which has shifted a little bit back towards the left, but this would be a much worse case scenario for Cedar Key and also Gainesville, and more enhanced conditions across the Tampa Bay metro area.
Storm preps ahead of Idalia got underway on Monday across the Tampa-St. Pete area. Mandatory evacuations were issued. Many of them kicked in early Monday afternoon. Some hotels asked their guests to leave immediately. We're fortunate at our hotel we have until noon on Tuesday. That's when the worst of the weather will start moving in. Later Tuesday afternoon into Wednesday, we expect wind gusts to peak at about 60 miles an hour in the Tampa-St. Pete area. Now, that's all dependent on the track of the storm and how strong it is as it gets up into this part of the Gulf of Mexico. And the mayor of Tampa spoke about those impacts earlier on Monday.
Although we haven't been hit in a century, we continue to prepare and take these storms very, very seriously. We've put out an emergency order. Shelters are opening, called for evacuations in our lower lying areas, reminding our residents to be prepared and letting them know that we are prepared as a city to meet the needs if, in fact, we are hit by the hurricane.
One of the biggest travel impacts in the area on Tuesday will be at Tampa International Airport. It's just down the causeway behind me. All flights have been canceled on Tuesday. And looking ahead to Wednesday as the storm pulls away, right now about 60% of departures have already been scrubbed. As far as schools go, they're closed Tuesday and Wednesday. Many of them hope to reopen on Thursday. Many of them are used as hurricane shelters. I'm meteorologist Mike Seidel in Tampa.
All right, Mike, thanks so much. And let's take a look at the latest on the storm now. It is a 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm and moving to the north at 8 miles per hour. Now, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the satellite imagery, and you see there's been a big burst of thunderstorms over the last 6 hours. So we've seen several waves of that where there's been this bursting going on. You notice that there's higher cloud off to the south and to the east here, not so much on the northwest side. It's been a little more restricted there because of some wind shear. But the thinking is that wind shear is going to relax going into tomorrow, and that's going to allow the system to really take off. It's got a very well-developed core. I mean, that core has been solid, even though the convection has been sort of waxing and waning. The core has been solid, and when you've got a solid core like that gets into an environment where the upper level environment is favorable, where you've got very warm water temperatures. I mean, there's no reason to believe that this thing can't take off at some point later tonight or tomorrow. And in fact, when we zoom in a little bit, you notice these little features on the northwest side here that look kind of like fingers coming out from the outflow like that, just like that. Those are called transverse bands, and those are often indicative of a strengthening tropical cyclone. So we may very well be looking at a strengthening phase tonight. Now, taking it farther to the north here, you see the water temperatures. They are way up there. 80 degrees is what it's requisite. We've got water temperatures in the upper 80s. So there's just a terrific amount of potential energy for the storm as it works north. And I want you to notice also the storm surge warnings and watches, which extend well to the south relative to the cone. So the cone is showing you the range of likely possibilities for the center of circulation. That can change, and a third of the time it can actually be outside of the cone. Anyway, so it's really important to not focus too much on the cone and to understand that there can be really significant impacts that are well outside of that area where the center is. And that's exactly what you see with the storm surge warnings that extend well to the south. So we wanted to take a closer look at storm surge potential here. And so it's not that we're going to see this level of storm surge in all of these places. This is showing you what could happen if things happen optimally for each of these locations. If, for example, the center of circulation comes in just to the north of Tampa, then we could be looking at a 4 to 7 foot surge, maybe even higher if the storm gets fairly strong into tomorrow. If it moves in more towards this region, then you're going to be looking at that significant surge in the along the nature coast and the Big Bend area. And in fact, look at this. Look how far inland that surge penetrates there into the Big Bend area. All those areas are where we would expect to see inundation, and one of those is Cedar Key, where there have been mandatory evacuations tonight. Again, this is the reasonable worst case scenario, but the modeling has generally been centered on the Big Bend region. And so here you see a potential for above 9 feet of storm surge there on Cedar Key. I read tonight that there are some people that are not listening to the mandatory evacuations that have decided to go ahead and ride this thing out. I'll tell you what, if you get a storm surge that is greater than 9 feet, you better hope that you've got some tall building that you can get into. A third or a fourth floor is the only thing that's going to keep you alive in a case like that. I mean, that is just such a significant level of surge. I would not want to be on Cedar Key. And we're also looking at a lot of surge potential in and around Tampa Bay, and we'll talk more about that coming up here in just a few minutes. Stay with us.
Watch the Weather Channel for ongoing coverage of Idalia. Get trusted updates on the storm only on the Weather Channel.
Well, people living in the Tampa area are busy gearing up for heavy rain, storm surge flooding, and high winds. Many of them spent the day filling up sandbags. And, with a lot of the past storm threats we've had here in Tampa Bay, we've actually been on the negative surge side, meaning we were north of the center circulation. So we were having all that pull of water out to sea and weren't getting the influx of water that typically comes with the storm surge. It really depends on where you are in the center and what the shape of the coastline looks like. So it's really hard to pinpoint those exact details until it happens, but it's very likely we're going to be on the south side of the center, which means we're going to have that surge of water then actually come in to Tampa Bay. The extent of then how much of that can we expect, because that's going to be the severity of the flooding and the inundation there for certain neighborhoods. Mandatory evacuations up for Zone A across Pinellas and Hillsborough counties, or at least throughout Tampa, St. Petersburg, and Clearwater. Tropical storm Idalia, even late tonight, still holding on as a strong tropical storm. Hasn't quite made it to hurricane status, but it's starting to get a little bit better organized, even in the last hour. So it wouldn't surprise me if by morning we have a hurricane on our hands. In fact, it's very likely we will have a hurricane by sunrise. And look at this, by tomorrow evening, we're talking a strong Category 2 hurricane now, making quite a bit of progress. So we expect speeding up of the movement, the forward movement, to increase here quite dramatically tomorrow, and then slowly start to tame off a little bit and then pick right back up again here. So interesting cone of as it pulls up through the northern part of Florida and then into coastal Georgia and the Carolinas. So there's a look at the hurricane warnings. These extend even into some of the counties there in south central Georgia, including Valdosta. You are under a hurricane warning all the way to I-75 and then down through Tampa and Bradenton under hurricane warnings. Tropical storm warnings extend through central Florida all the way back over to Daytona Beach and Jacksonville Beach, as well as tropical storm watches, which extend through Savannah and then Charleston, South Carolina. So here's an idea of how things will evolve on your Tuesday, because things start to go downhill pretty quickly here tomorrow. We start to get into those outer bands, and they really get kind of pronounced as we get into the afternoon across the Panhandle. Tampa will have some squally weather, and these may have some strong gusts with them. Frequent lightning. Oftentimes those outer bands will be notorious for frequent lightning and also the possibility of severe weather. We could have a few isolated tornadoes, something we'll have to watch even into South Florida for Tuesday. That's really about it for Miami and West Palm Beach, though. Then the focal point becomes the Central Coast and then landfall as we go into early Wednesday morning. So the core of the intense winds will be right there in that eye wall. That's where we'll have the greatest surge of water, where this just south of the center. Oftentimes where you have landfall, south of there is actually where you have the worst storm surge, depending upon the coastline. Obviously, it's flipped if your coastline's different. But there's a look at what we're talking about for tropical storm probabilities, pretty much 100% from Cedar Key south through Tampa Bay. We do expect tropical storm conditions from the Big Bend all the way down through southwest Florida, and those arrive as early as the middle part of the afternoon tomorrow, and then later in the evening for parts of northern Florida. So as far as hurricane probabilities, these continue to go up, and again, as consistency continues, we're really looking at areas between Cedar Key and St. Mark's. That seems to be kind of the fine line, but a little jog 30 miles can mean all the difference. Could that, if this were, if we were to put a center line right there, this would be a worst case scenario for Cedar Key. But if it jogged 30 miles, maybe took a little bump to the right a little bit, that then could change our outcome hugely in a place like Cedar Key and then increase the worst outcomes 30 miles to the south of there. So it really depends on those last minute setups that are just unpredictable. Really have to watch, but it's going to be fair game between the Big Bend and Tampa Bay. Tornadoes, always a possibility with tropical cyclones, and we'll see that starting tomorrow in those outer bands and then pushing up into the Carolinas as we go into your Wednesday. And then Thursday, still keeping active here from coastal South Carolina in through the Outer Banks and eastern parts of North Carolina. So wind, a huge factor, Carl. Rainfall will be notable. We'll have flash flooding, of course, where we have, the heaviest rain in the center. But even more concerning is the storm surge aspect.
Yeah, that's just really worrying because of the nature of the coastline here in Florida. It is the most surge vulnerable section of coastline in the entire country. And then here you see the storm surge potential. We wanted to dig on into the reasonable worst case scenario, dropping into the Big Bend area of Florida and Cedar Key. Here you see on Cedar Key, there could be as much as 9+ feet of surge. So think about that. If you think about a basketball hoop is 10 feet usually. And so if you're looking at a 9+ foot storm surge, you're talking about water to the level or nearly so of a basketball hoop. It's just not survivable. You've got, wave action on top of that and all kinds of wind. You just don't want to be anywhere near the coast in a situation like that. And we see that farther down the coast as well. We get over here south of Crystal River and into the Cutlers area. You see along Route 19 there, pockets where there could be 9 feet plus of storm surge. Then farther down the coast into Port Richey and New Port Richey, west of 19. Again, potentially 9 feet of storm storm surge. And then down into the Tampa Bay area, we also see a lot of potential for storm surge in this area east of St. Petersburg. You get into Shore Acres there, and also to the south of that, down around Brightwaters Boulevard and around 40th Avenue. A really significant surge that's up to 9 feet in the orange, and then across and into the area around Port Tampa and MacDill Air Force Base. Again, many areas seeing up to 9 feet of storm surge in the worst case scenario. And we'll have more on this threat coming up in a few minutes.
A former National Hurricane Center director, one trusted best-in-class expert team, America's most trusted news network, the Weather Channel.
Welcome back to our coverage of Tropical Storm Idalia, and we are looking at a storm that is going to be a significant storm tomorrow. It is forecast to be a major hurricane as it comes towards northwest Florida and the Big Bend area, but a very large area of potential storm surge for the most surge vulnerable section of coastline in the entire country, and we'll take a look at that forecast in a moment. So right now it's moving north at 8 miles per hour, and when you look at this from a satellite perspective, not a classic satellite perspective of a storm that is very nearly a hurricane, but there has been this big burst of thunderstorms near the center. We've seen several rounds of that. What's been happening today is that there's been some wind shear coming around this area of high pressure, probably driving in a little bit of drier air as well, but it keeps bouncing back, and that core has been really resilient. And when you've got a storm that's got a really well-defined core with a lot of persistent convection about it, once that gets into a healthier environment relative to the storm, then, the sky's the limit, really. And we think that that's going to happen. That shear is going to be lessening going into tomorrow. The water temperatures are exceptionally warm. It's already showing some interesting signs tonight. If you look very closely, you see these features that look almost like fibers or hairs on the northwest side. Those are called transverse bands. And as those come off the top of that cirrus outflow there, that is usually indicative of a strengthening system, of a system that is getting stronger quickly. So we may very well be entering a strengthening phase for this storm. And when you look at water temperatures along the forecast track here, they're very warm. I mean, they're way up there in the upper 80s throughout the eastern part of the Gulf. There is so much potential energy in those warm Gulf waters, and that is a big part of why we think this thing could get much, much stronger going into tomorrow. So it is forecast to become a major hurricane, a Category 3 storm, as it is approaching. That's going to be late tomorrow. Impacts well outside of that center of circulation. There you see the storm surge warnings and storm surge watch. A large area of potential life-threatening storm surge. It's not going to be this everywhere, but near the center and then to the southeast of the center, that's where the very worst of the surge is going to be. And so we could be looking at 4 to 7 feet of storm surge there in the Tampa Bay metro area. Maybe even a little more if the storm is very strong and comes in just to the north of Tampa. And so there have been evacuations ordered for Zone A, and that includes the beaches here, Clearwater Beach and down into Reddington and down into St. Pete Beach as well. The east side of St. Petersburg, including Shore Acres, and then farther to the east there around MacDill. A lot of areas under evacuation orders tonight because we could be looking at significant surge coming in with this storm. storm. Hurricane warnings in effect in the northwest part of the state, also up into South Georgia. Tropical storm watches added with the last advisory. And here's a look at the forecast area of strong winds. And so the tropical storm force winds are there in orange, and you see they start to move in tomorrow night into the west central part of the state, continue to roll in as we get deeper into the evening, and then the really strong winds approaching in the early morning hours and through the morning in northwest Florida, coming up into Gainesville and Jacksonville through the middle of the day, and then moving over to Savannah and also into Charleston. So power outages are going to be likely and widespread there in northern Florida and also in southeast Georgia. And we're going to be looking at a lot of tree damage as well. And then also a tornado threat in the west central part of the state, the northern part of the state, and a very serious heavy rain threat as it continues up into southeast Georgia and also into the Carolinas. Large area of heavy rain here, and inland flooding is also going to be a major concern with this storm. Chris, over to you.
All right, let's talk about some of those impacts that we'll see as it pulls away from landfall and pushes up into northern Florida, as well as parts of Georgia and South Carolina. So there's a look at the track. We've been talking a lot about the Gulf Coast, and for good reason, but we're going to have some significant impacts here too in coastal Georgia, parts of the low country coast of South Carolina. And remember, winds flow counterclockwise around a low pressure, so a tropical cyclone, low pressure. So we're going to get that onshore push early on in the game for coastal Georgia and South Carolina, even North Carolina. So things for us really go downhill later in the morning on Wednesday, starting to get those outer bands in through South Carolina, rain ramping up quickly in Georgia, and heavy rainfall through Georgia and South Carolina throughout the day on Wednesday into early Thursday morning as it continues here through North Carolina, and then by Thursday afternoon starting to pull offshore, still keeping things wet though in the Outer Banks and eastern parts of the state. So flash flooding is certainly likely, not just where we expect landfall, but watching this all the way up into the I-95 corridor, including Savannah, Hilton Head, and Charleston. So we talked about the winds. Here's a look at the timing for northern Florida along that I-10 corridor. Winds really pick up as we go into early on Wednesday. Expecting the worst of the winds near landfall and within a 50-mile proximity of the center. That's where gusts could be as high as over 100 miles per hour, especially if we're dealing with a major hurricane as is forecasted. And we may still deal with hurricane force gusts up through Jacksonville and also coastal Georgia. That brings cities like Savannah in play. Rainfall going to be a huge ordeal as well. And for cities like Hilton Head and Charleston, Savannah, we could see gusts as high as 60 to 70 miles per hour. Welcome back into our special live coverage here on the Weather Channel as we are tracking the latest on Tropical Storm Idalia. Again, we'll get an intermediate advisory at 2 a.m. Eastern time. Right now, still holding at 70 miles per hour, with pressure at 983, moving to the north at about 8 miles per hour. I do expect that forward speed to start picking up, and you can clearly see that little nudge to the north. And that's expected, but it's starting to happen a little bit more quickly, and we expect this to speed up throughout the day on Tuesday, and that's why it's really going to make some progress. And we're expecting landfall pretty early on Wednesday morning, and it does depend if it moves towards the eastern part of the track or maybe a few hours later if it takes that track to the west. Either way, hurricane warnings are up and they extend into south central Georgia. Valdosta, you're included in the hurricane warning, as well as Lake City, Florida, the western side of Gainesville and Alachua County included, as well as all of the Tampa Bay metro area from Manatee County north. And then we watch the tropical storm watches extend up through Savannah and Charleston, South Carolina, because there will be impacts there as well. So if you haven't finished your preparations, or maybe you're waiting until the morning to evacuate, be sure to do so pretty early. By lunchtime, we start to see some of those squally outer bands kind of hit us here along the southwest coast of Florida, and then really ramp up as we go into tomorrow evening around dinner time. There's what will likely be at that point a strong hurricane Idalia getting up through the Big Bend of Florida. But if you live in Tallahassee, if you live in Gainesville, if you live in Tampa, you need to have your preparations underway and be ready to go by tomorrow night.
And now your tropical update. Here's the latest advisory. A look from above. The latest forecast track